Hey there. Welcome back to Bedtime Story. I know many of you listen to these videos as you fall asleep, so before you settle in, I'd really love to hear where you're tuning in from. And if these stories have been keeping you company at night, leaving a like and subscribing would mean a lot. Now, let's relax, get cozy, take a slow breath, and begin. In this new story. True horror stories from February Road trips into Appalachia. The early morning mist clung to the jagged peaks of the Monongahela National Forest as Elias Thorne steered his sedan through the winding mountain passes. 2026 brought an unusually harsh winter to West Virginia, and the 28-year-old freelance photographer sought to document the frozen landscapes. He carried only a heavy parka and a high-end digital camera while aiming for the secluded ridges near the Randolph County line. The heater hummed against the biting chill of the February air as the asphalt gave way to a narrow gravel path. Thick pine trees crowded the shoulders of the road and limited his visibility to a few dozen feet in the gray light. Every mile deeper into the wilderness felt like a step further away from the safety of the modern world. State records from 2026 indicate that Thorne was reported missing by his sister 3 days after he failed to return. Local dispatch logs show that his vehicle was discovered abandoned on a Forest Service road with the driver's side door left wide open. Investigators found his camera on the passenger seat, but the memory card had been removed and was nowhere to be found. There were no signs of a struggle or any footprints in the thin layer of crusty snow surrounding the vehicle. Some locals claimed they heard a rhythmic metallic tapping coming from the woods that evening, but authorities never confirmed these reports. The silence of the Appalachian wilderness remained the only witness to the sudden disappearance of the young man from the roadside. County files from 2009 detail a similar occurrence involving a couple traveling through the same region during a winter storm. Sarah and Mark Miller were driving toward a remote cabin rental when their GPS reportedly began cycling through various conflicting sets of coordinates. The 30-year-old engineers were well prepared for the cold, but archived notes suggest they became disoriented near the Blackwater Falls. Search teams later located their SUV parked perfectly straight in the middle of a bridge with the engine still idling. All of their personal belongings, including wallets and cell phones, were neatly stacked on the dashboard in a precise vertical pile. Recovery efforts were hampered by the shifting terrain and the fact that various state records conflict regarding the exact find. A park ranger documented a series of archived notes regarding strange acoustic anomalies reported by hikers in the West Virginia highlands. These reports often describe the sound of a human voice mimicking the exact tone and cadence of a distress call. Investigators noted that these sounds were frequently heard near deep limestone caves where the acoustics can create deceptive or confusing auditory reflections. One specific entry from 2024 mentions a group of travelers who stopped their car because they heard a child crying. They followed the sound for several hundred yards into the brush before realizing the source was moving at an impossible speed. No evidence of a child or any other person was found in that sector during the subsequent law enforcement sweep. The mystery of the Appalachian road trips in February persists as more archive notes surface regarding these unexplained and cold cases. Forensic evidence often yields no biological traces or clues that would suggest the involvement of any known predatory mountain wildlife. Public records from the county level consistently show that these incidents occur during periods of high atmospheric pressure and low visibility. Families of the missing often wait for years while state records remain open and the official status of the files stays unresolved. The roads through the mountains stay quiet, and the high ridges of the forest continue to hold their secrets in silence. Travelers are simply advised to stay within their vehicles and keep their communication devices charged while traversing the lonely peaks. Another county file from 2012 recounts the story of a lone trucker named Julian who was delivering supplies to a town. He was 42 years old and had driven the same route through the mountains for over 15 years without any issues. On a Tuesday night in late February, he reported seeing a person standing in the middle of the road wearing a yellow raincoat. The figure did not move as the truck approached, and Julian was forced to slam on his brakes to avoid a collision. When he exited the cab to check on the individual, the road ahead was completely empty for several hundred yards. He reportedly checked his dash camera footage later, but the screen showed only static during the time of the supposed encounter. The archive notes from the local sheriff department describe how Julian refused to drive through that specific mountain pass ever again after that night. He claimed that the yellow raincoat was dry despite the heavy snow that was falling steadily throughout the entire evening. State records show that several other drivers had reported a similar figure in that exact location over the span of 3 decades. Investigators never confirmed the identity of the person, and no missing person reports from the area matched the description provided. Some locals claimed it was a trick of the light reflecting off the snow, but the dash camera failure remained unexplained. The incident remains listed as a miscellaneous anomaly in the county archives from 2012, with no further investigative leads followed. In 2018, a group of university students was conducting a geological survey near the border of Virginia and West Virginia. The 3 individuals were in their early 20s and had planned a 5-day expedition to study the local rock formations. According to dispatch logs, they checked in on the second night, but their final scheduled transmission was never received by the base. A massive search operation was launched involving multiple state agencies and local volunteers who combed the rugged terrain for weeks. They found the students' campsite completely intact, with their sleeping bags still laid out and a campfire that had burned out naturally. All of their high-tech geological equipment was left behind, including expensive sensors that were still recording data during the search. The recorded data from the sensors showed a massive spike in electromagnetic activity at the exact moment the final transmission was cut. Investigators could not explain why 3 healthy young adults would wander away from a warm camp without their shoes or jackets. Archive notes from the lead detective mentioned that the footprints leading away from the camp stopped abruptly after only 10 yards. It was as if the students had simply ceased to exist while walking toward the edge of a nearby steep ravine. Search dogs were unable to pick up a scent, and the aerial infrared scans showed no heat signatures in the vicinity. The case of the missing students from 2018 is still discussed by investigators who specialize in unusual wilderness disappearances. Reports from 2015 describe a phenomenon known among some locals as the phantom headlights of the Appalachian backroads. Drivers frequently reported being followed by a large vehicle with bright lights that would maintain a constant distance for several miles. Whenever the driver would pull over to let the vehicle pass, the headlights would instantly vanish into the darkness of the night. One county file from 2015 notes a driver who tried to outrun the lights and reach speeds over 90 miles. He eventually crashed into a guardrail, but dispatch logs indicate he was the only person on that road for 30 miles. The lights were never caught on any roadside cameras, and investigators never confirmed the existence of a second vehicle involved. State records show that these sightings are most common during the month of February, when the mountain air is particularly dense and cold. Some investigators believe that atmospheric reflections of distant city lights could be responsible for the visual illusions experienced by the drivers. However, the frequency of these reports in areas with no direct line of sight to any major cities remains a conflict. Archive notes from a retired state trooper suggest that the lights always seem to appear near the sites of past accidents. No forensic evidence has ever been found to link these visual phenomena to any physical objects or known atmospheric conditions. The mystery of the phantom headlights remains a staple of local lore for those who travel through the Appalachian Heights. Records from 2006 document the case of a 35-year-old biologist named Clara who was studying winter hibernation patterns. She was traveling alone through the Greenbrier region when she reportedly made a frantic call to her husband from a satellite phone. Clara stated that she had found a cluster of abandoned vehicles deep in a valley where no roads actually existed. Investigators never confirmed the location of this valley despite extensive aerial surveys conducted in the following weeks after her disappearance. The satellite log showed the call originated from a coordinate point that was located inside a solid rock mountain face. Clara has not been seen since that day, and her vehicle was never recovered from the dense Appalachian forest floor. County files from 2022 mention a series of metallic containers found scattered across a remote ridge by a local hunter. The 39-year-old man reported that the containers were sealed and bore no markings or serial numbers of any kind. When federal investigators arrived at the scene 48 hours later, the ridge was completely empty and the soil appeared scorched. Some locals claimed they saw unmarked black helicopters operating in the area during the night, but official records conflict on this detail. Investigators never confirmed what was in the containers or who had placed them in such a difficult-to-reach location. The hunter reportedly moved out of the state shortly after the incident and refused to speak with any local journalists. Archive notes from a 2005 investigation highlight a recurring sound described by residents as the groaning of the mountains. This low-frequency vibration reportedly occurs only during the coldest weeks of February and can last for several hours at a time. State records indicate that seismographs in the region do not detect any tectonic activity during these specific windows of time. Some investigators suggest that the sound is caused by the freezing and expanding of water within the deep limestone cavern systems. However, the rhythmic nature of the sound led some locals to claim it sounded more like a mechanical process. The source of the groaning remains unknown and continues to be a point of debate among those who study Appalachian acoustics. In this news story, a Valentine's night no one ever forgot. The small town of Hinton sits quietly along the New River in the rugged mountains of southern West Virginia. On the evening of February 14, 2016, a local resident named Thomas Miller prepared for a simple night. He was a 32-year-old mechanic who had lived in the region his entire life without incident. The freezing rain began to fall against the glass of his remote cabin as the sun dipped behind the ridges. Neighbors later reported seeing his porch light flickering through the dense fog that settled into the valley that evening. Investigators never confirmed what drew him toward the edge of the woods during the peak of the winter storm. Dispatch logs from the county sheriff department indicate a call was placed from the Miller residence at 10:42. The operator heard only the sound of heavy wind and the rhythmic ticking of a clock in the background. Two officers arrived at the property 30 minutes later to find the front door standing open to the freezing air. They found a single set of boot prints leading away from the porch and into the thick brush. State records show that Thomas had no history of wandering, and his vehicle remained parked in the gravel driveway. The interior of the home appeared undisturbed, with a warm meal still sitting on the wooden kitchen table. Search teams arrived at daybreak to find the tracks ended abruptly near a limestone outcrop known as the Devil's Throat. Some locals claimed they heard a low humming sound echoing through the trees during the early morning hours. Forensic teams examined the area but found no evidence of a struggle or any secondary sets of footprints. Archived notes from a similar event in 1984 suggest the ground in that area is prone to instability. The official report noted that the temperature had dropped to 12 degrees, which made survival unlikely without proper winter gear. Investigators remained baffled by the lack of physical clues left behind in the fresh snow and frozen mud. A county file from 2009 mentions strange acoustic anomalies reported by hikers near that specific mountain ridge. The records conflict regarding whether these sounds are caused by wind or by underground caverns shifting in the cold. Thomas's family maintained that he was a cautious man who would never venture out into a storm. His disappearance remains an open case with the local authorities, who still conduct occasional sweeps of the deep forest. The town of Hinton remembers that night as a reminder of how quickly the mountains can claim a life. No body was ever recovered, and the mechanic's tools still sit untouched in his quiet workshop. The search expanded to the surrounding hollows, where the terrain becomes nearly impassable for those without deep local knowledge. Volunteers from 3 neighboring counties joined the effort, but the record cold temperatures forced many to retreat by nightfall. State records indicate that air heat signatures were impossible to detect due to the thickness of the hemlock canopy. Some locals claimed that the silence in the woods that week was unnatural even for a West Virginia winter. Investigators never confirmed if Thomas had any reason to leave his home without his heavy winter coat or boots. The boots he wore were reportedly his lighter work pair, which left shallow impressions in the hardening icy crust. By the 7th day of the investigation, the sheriff department noted several discrepancies in the initial witness statements. One neighbor insisted they saw a second figure standing near the tree line, but the dispatch logs mentioned no intruders. Archived notes from the local historical society describe deep vertical shafts in the limestone that are not on modern maps. These shafts were allegedly used for ventilation during the mining boom of 1922, but were never properly sealed. Records conflict on the exact location of these openings, which makes any ground search extremely dangerous for the recovery teams. The case file remains active, though no new physical evidence has surfaced in the decades since Thomas vanished. A secondary witness named Sarah Jenkins worked as a nurse at the county hospital located 20 miles from the scene. She reportedly told investigators that she saw a man matching the description of Thomas walking near Route 20. This sighting occurred nearly 3 hours after the initial 911 call was placed from the empty cabin in the woods. State records from that night show that the road was completely blocked by fallen timber and deep snowdrifts. Investigators never confirmed how a man on foot could travel that distance through a blizzard in such a short time. Some locals claimed the man she saw was actually a hunter who had been stranded in the same storm. Dispatch logs from 2017 show that a backpack was found by a group of surveyors in a creek bed. The item was heavily weathered and contained a set of keys that belonged to a Ford truck from 2012. Records conflict on whether these keys were ever tested against the vehicle still sitting in the Miller driveway today. Archived notes from the lead detective suggest that the backpack was actually dropped there much later than the disappearance date. Forensic analysts found no biological material on the straps or inside the pockets, despite the item being outdoors for years. This piece of evidence only added to the growing list of contradictions surrounding the cold case in West Virginia. The topography of the region around Hinton is famous for its hidden caves and vast networks of underground drainage systems. Investigators never confirmed if the limestone outcrop near the cabin was connected to a larger subterranean complex beneath the ridge. Some locals claimed that they saw lights moving deep within the woods for weeks following the official search suspension. State records indicate no authorized personnel were in the area during those specific nights due to the extreme weather conditions. A county file from 2021 notes that several pets went missing from the same neighborhood that winter. These events were reportedly dismissed by the authorities as typical predator activity common in the Appalachian wilderness. Thomas Miller was described by his coworkers as a man of habit who rarely deviated from his daily mechanical routine. He was 32 years old and had planned to move to a larger city the following spring. Records conflict regarding his mental state during the final weeks leading up to the Valentine's Night disappearance in 2016. Some neighbors mentioned he had grown increasingly quiet, while others reported he seemed excited about his upcoming career change. Investigators never confirmed any history of depression or a desire to walk away from his life without a word. The cabin remains empty, and the surrounding forest continues to grow over the paths where he was last seen. A retired state trooper named Robert Vance revisited the site 3 years later to conduct his own private investigation. He reportedly discovered a series of markings carved into the trees roughly 2 miles north of the Miller property line. Archived notes from his journal described the symbols as geometric patterns that did not match local trail markers or logging codes. Some locals claimed these marks were simply the work of bored teenagers looking to create an urban legend in the woods. Investigators never confirmed if these carvings were fresh or if they had been present during the original search in 2016. The wood was deeply scarred and showed signs of being etched with a very sharp, heavy metallic instrument. State records from 1955 detail a similar disappearance involving a timber scout who vanished in the same square mile. The scout was a 40-year-old veteran who was intimately familiar with the weather patterns of southern West Virginia. Dispatch logs from that era mention a search that lasted for 3 weeks before being officially called off by the governor. Investigators never confirmed a connection between the two cases, despite the identical nature of the footprints ending at the limestone. Some locals claimed that the ridge holds a specific magnetic charge that interferes with compasses and modern navigation equipment. This theory was reportedly tested by a university team in 2018, but the results remained entirely inconclusive. The county file from 2019 includes a testimony from a local pilot who flew over the ridge that winter. He reportedly saw a dark circular patch in the snow where the heat seemed to have melted the ice completely. Records conflict on whether this was a natural thermal vent or something related to the abandoned mining infrastructure below. Investigators never confirmed the coordinates of the patch because the snow covered it again before a ground team could arrive. Archived notes from the Geological Survey state that there are no known volcanic or thermal activities in that part of the state. The pilot insisted that the circle was perfectly symmetrical and roughly 30 feet in diameter according to his altimeter. In the spring of 2022, a heavy flood washed away a portion of the riverbank near the Miller cabin. A local fisherman found a rusted metal box caught in the roots of an old sycamore tree 3 miles downstream. The box reportedly contained several handwritten letters dated from February 14, 1999, but the ink was mostly illegible. Investigators never confirmed if these letters belonged to a previous tenant or were related to the disappearance of Thomas Miller. Some locals claimed the handwriting matched a local schoolteacher who had moved away from the region decades prior to the event. The county file indicates that the box was logged as found property and sits in a storage locker today. Thomas Miller's mother still lives in a neighboring town and refuses to believe her son simply walked into the woods. She reportedly receives phone calls on Valentine's night that consist of nothing but static and the sound of distant wind. Records conflict on whether these calls originate from a local landline or a spoofed digital number from outside the country. Investigators never confirmed the source of the signals because they usually last for less than 5 seconds before the line cuts. Some locals claimed it is a cruel prank played by people who know the tragic history of the Miller family. Archive notes from the telecom provider show that the calls often coincide with local power surges in the valley. The mystery of Thomas Miller remains one of the most discussed cold cases in the history of southern West Virginia law enforcement. No trace of his clothing or personal items has ever been found within the 5-mile radius of the limestone outcrop. State records indicate that the case will remain open until physical remains are identified through DNA testing or dental record comparison. Some locals claimed they still see a light in the window of the cabin during the month of February each year. Investigators never confirm these reports as the property has been disconnected from the electrical grid for over 7 years now. The mountain stands silent as a monument to a night that changed the small town of Hinton forever. In this new story, something followed them while camping. In the deep woods of the Cascade Mountains during July of 2024, a terrifying event reportedly changed 2 lives. Mark was a 28-year-old civil engineer who often looked for peace within the remote regions of the Pacific Northwest. He had spent years exploring the various trails of Washington state, and he felt very comfortable in the dense evergreen forests. His partner, Sarah, was a 27-year-old pharmacy technician who wanted to escape the stress of her daily office work. They had planned this specific trip for several months, and they were both excited to spend some time under the stars. The couple arrived at the trailhead early on a Friday morning while the mist was still clinging to the tall pine trees. They checked their equipment one last time, and then they began the long journey toward a high ridge overlooking a lake. Dispatch logs from the Forest Service show that they had registered their itinerary with the local ranger station before they started. The path was steep and narrow, but they made good time as they climbed higher into the rugged and wild terrain. They reportedly found a suitable campsite near a small stream that provided them with a reliable source of fresh and cold water. Sarah began setting up their small tent, while Mark gathered enough firewood to last them through the duration of the chilly night. The sun began to dip below the horizon, and the shadows grew long across the forest floor as they finished their work. They didn't see anyone else on the trail that day, and they believed they were completely alone in the vast wilderness. While they were eating their dinner by the fire, Sarah mentioned that she felt a strange presence looming just beyond the light. Mark scanned the dark perimeter with his high-powered flashlight, but he didn't see anything unusual among the thick trunks of the trees. He told her that it was likely just a deer, or perhaps a small bear foraging for food in the nearby brush. They tried to relax, but the oppressive silence of the forest made them feel increasingly uneasy as the night grew much colder. State records later indicated that the couple went to sleep around 11 o'clock, but their rest was interrupted by a rhythmic tapping. Something was reportedly striking the side of their tent with a light and persistent force that sounded like a thin wooden stick. Mark sat up and listened intently to the sound, but it stopped as soon as he reached for his tactical camping knife. He didn't want to alarm Sarah, so he stayed quiet while he stared at the thin fabric of the tent wall. The next morning, they found several small stones placed in a perfect circle around the cold remains of their campfire from the night. Sarah was certain that those rocks were not there when they had gone to sleep, and she started to feel very afraid. Mark tried to find a logical explanation for the circle, but he couldn't think of any natural process that would do that. They decided to keep their original plan and hike further into the mountains, despite the growing sense of dread that they felt. County files from 2024 note that the couple felt a heavy presence following them as they moved up the trail. Every time they stopped to rest, they would hear the sound of branches breaking in the thick woods about 50 yards behind. Mark looked back several times, but the dense foliage made it impossible to see if a person or an animal was there. They couldn't explain why whatever was following them stayed just out of sight while maintaining such a consistent and frightening pace. As evening approached, they reached a high plateau that offered a wide view of the valley, but they didn't feel any safer. The wind began to pick up, and the temperature dropped rapidly as a thick layer of gray clouds moved over the peaks. They set up their camp in a small clearing, and they made sure to keep their gear very close to the tent. Sarah reportedly saw a tall and thin shadow move behind a large boulder, but it vanished before she could point it out. Investigators never confirmed the identity of the figure, but archived notes suggest that someone might have been living illegally in those woods. During the middle of the second night, the couple was woken up by the sound of heavy breathing just outside their tent. Mark didn't hesitate this time, and he shouted loudly to scare away whatever was standing right next to their sleeping heads. He heard something scramble away into the darkness, but the sounds were bipedal, and they definitely did not belong to a bear. The two hikers didn't wait for morning to arrive before they packed their essential items and started the long descent back down. They left their expensive tent and their heavy sleeping bags behind because they were terrified of staying in that location any longer. Every step they took felt like a race against an unseen predator that was watching them from the safety of the shadows. They reportedly reached their car as the first light of dawn began to touch the tops of the highest trees in Washington. A subsequent search by the local authorities found their abandoned gear, but there were no signs of a struggle at the camp. State records show that the case was eventually closed due to a lack of physical evidence or any identifiable suspects in the region. Records conflict regarding the number of similar reports, but some locals claimed that several other hikers had vanished in that specific area. Mark and Sarah never returned to the Gifford-Pinchot National Forest, and they don't plan on going camping ever again in life. Local county files from 2024 describe the physical state of the abandoned items that the search party recovered near the ridge. The tent had been neatly folded, but the poles were missing and the fabric had several small holes that looked like bite marks. Sarah's digital camera was found resting on a flat rock about 20 yards away from the original site of their base camp. The investigators found no images on the memory card, except for a single blurry photo of a dark shape among the trees. A detailed report from the state records suggests that the hikers were lucky to have escaped the wilderness without any physical injuries. The region where they were camping has a long history of unexplained disappearances that date back to the early 1980s. Dispatch logs show that multiple search and rescue missions have been launched in that specific area over the last several decades. Most of those cases ended without any resolution, and the missing people were never seen by their friends or their families. Mark reportedly struggled with night terrors for several months after the incident, and he often woke up feeling like he was being watched. He told his therapist that he could still hear the sound of the heavy breathing right next to his ear every night. Sarah decided to move to a different city because the sight of the nearby mountains caused her to have severe panic attacks. They tried to find answers by talking to other hikers online, but they only found more stories that were equally disturbing. Records conflict about whether the authorities ever interviewed a suspicious man who was seen wandering near the trailhead that same weekend in July. This individual was reportedly wearing a heavy winter coat despite the warm weather, and he did not have any hiking or camping gear. He disappeared before the sheriff's deputies could arrive at the scene to ask him about his presence in the National Forest area. No one knows for sure what was following Mark and Sarah that weekend, but the evidence remains locked in a county file. The trail they followed was known as the High Ridge Loop, which covers over 20 miles of some of the most difficult terrain. Archived notes from the local hiking club mention that several parts of the trail are prone to sudden fog and very low visibility. Mark and Sarah had prepared for these conditions by bringing extra layers of clothing and a reliable GPS device for their navigation needs. They didn't anticipate that the main threat would come from something that was watching them from within the shadows of the trees. When the search party arrived at the campsite, they noticed that the surrounding brush had been cleared in a very deliberate and unnatural way. State records indicate that the branches were snapped at a height of about 7 feet, which is much higher than any local animal. The investigators also found a small pile of rusted metal objects that had been placed carefully near the entrance of the abandoned tent. These items included old tin cans and a broken pocket watch that appeared to be from the early part of the 20th century. County files from 2024 show that the sheriff was deeply concerned about the strange patterns that were discovered at the forest site. There was no sign of a struggle or any blood, but the overall atmosphere of the camp was described as being very malevolent. One deputy reported hearing a faint whistling sound coming from the deep ravine while he was collecting the hikers' belongings for the official report. He didn't find the source of the noise, but he later resigned from his position at the department due to a nervous breakdown. Investigators never confirmed if the strange items found at the camp belonged to a person who had been living in the woods for years. Some locals claimed that an old hermit had been seen near the lake, but no official records exist to prove his actual identity. The case remains open, and it is still discussed by many people who enjoy exploring the mysteries of the Pacific Northwest wilderness region. Mark and Sarah's story serves as a grim reminder that some things in the woods are better left alone and completely undisturbed. The pharmacy where Sarah worked eventually granted her a long leave of absence so she could focus on her mental health and her recovery. She spent many hours in therapy trying to process the events of that weekend, but the fear remained deeply rooted in her mind. Mark also found it difficult to return to his normal life, and he eventually sold all of his camping and hiking equipment online. They don't talk about that trip anymore because the memories are too painful and they only want to move forward with their lives. Dispatch logs from the night of the incident reveal that several other callers had reported seeing strange lights in the sky over the forest. These reports were never linked to the experience of the two hikers, but they add another layer of mystery to the entire situation. Some people believe that the forest itself has a way of manipulating the minds of those who dare to enter its deepest parts. Records conflict on this theory, but the fact remains that Mark and Sarah were changed forever by what they experienced in Washington. The final report from the county coroner's office mentioned that no physical crimes were committed during the duration of the couple's camping trip. However, the psychological impact of being stalked by an unknown entity is often much more damaging than any physical injury could ever be. State records from 2024 are now archived, and they are only available to those who have a very specific legal reason. The truth about what happened on that high ridge in the Cascade Mountains may never be fully known by the public or authorities. A local reporter attempted to investigate the history of the High Ridge Loop, but he found that many of the files were missing. He reportedly spoke to a retired forest ranger who claimed that the government had purchased several large tracts of land in that area. These state records were allegedly sealed for national security reasons, but no one could explain why a forest would need such high protection. The reporter eventually dropped the story after he received several anonymous phone calls warning him to stop his research into the local matter. Mark once told a close friend that he saw a face peering through the mesh of the tent during the second night of camp. He described the features as being very pale and sunken with eyes that seemed to reflect the light of the dying embers outside. Sarah reportedly didn't see the face, but she felt the weight of something heavy pressing against the side of her sleeping bag. They both agreed that the entity was not trying to help them, but was instead waiting for the perfect moment to strike. The trail has since been closed to the public due to a series of rock slides that made the path too dangerous for most hikers. Some locals claimed that the rock slides were not a natural event, but were instead caused by someone who wanted to keep people away. Investigators never confirmed these rumors, and the official state records simply cite the weather as the primary cause for the trail closure. The Gifford-Pinchot National Forest remains a place of beauty and mystery, but for some, it is a place of absolute terror. The county file from 2024 includes a series of photographs taken of the ground where the tent had been located. These images show a pattern of deep depressions that look like someone had been kneeling in the dirt for a long time. Investigators never confirmed what caused these marks, but they were certainly not made by any equipment that the hikers had brought along. Some locals claimed that this specific spot was known to be avoided by the native tribes who lived in the region. State records show that the case was officially moved to a cold status after 6 months of investigation yielded no new leads. The hikers tried to resume their lives, but the psychological scars were far more permanent than they could have ever possibly imagined. Sarah reportedly sold her house and moved to a city that was far away from any large forests or remote wilderness areas. Mark began to study the local history of the Cascades in an attempt to find some kind of peace or closure. He reportedly found several old newspaper articles that mentioned a similar incident occurring in the same general area back in 1982. Those records conflict with the official police reports of that time, which stated that the missing hikers had simply lost their way. However, the archived notes from the search team described finding the exact same circle of stones around the abandoned campfire. This detail was never released to the general public, and it remains a secret kept within the locked files of the county. The story of Mark and Sarah is a quiet but terrifying example of the unknown dangers that can lurk in our world. We like to think that we're safe when we enter the woods, but the truth is often much more complex and frightening. They don't have the answers they're looking for, and they likely never will find the truth about that cold July weekend. Sometimes the things that follow us out of the darkness are the things that we can never truly understand or explain away. In this new story, true scary hiking stories from deep Appalachia. The Appalachian Trail near the town of Damascus, Virginia, remained a favored destination for experienced hikers during the spring of 2016. Thomas Miller was a 32-year-old civil engineer who spent his weekends navigating the more isolated ridgelines of the Blue Ridge Mountains. He arrived at the trailhead with the intention of completing a 40-mile loop through the high country over 3 days. Local dispatch logs indicated that the weather conditions were favorable when Thomas first set out into the dense timber and rocky terrain. The initial stretch of the journey followed a well-marked path that climbed steadily toward the limestone cliffs overlooking the valley below. The forest canopy in this region of the southern mountains was known for its ability to block out almost all natural sunlight even during the midday hours. Thomas noted in his personal logs that the atmosphere felt unusually heavy as he crossed the state line into a less traveled wilderness sector. State records from 2016 show that the local wildlife populations were stable and there were no reports of aggressive bear activity in the vicinity. He reached the first elevation marker by late afternoon and prepared to transition into the deeper drainage basins that defined the central loop. The trail narrowed significantly here as the hardwoods gave way to ancient hemlocks and thick blankets of damp mountain laurel. By the second afternoon, Thomas reportedly reached a section of the forest where the undergrowth became significantly more dense and difficult to navigate. State records from that period noted that several hikers had previously reported feeling a sense of disorientation while passing through this specific drainage basin. He decided to establish a temporary camp near a small creek that was not clearly marked on his primary topographic map. Investigators later found archived notes suggesting that the topography in this region often shifted due to seasonal runoff and minor geological movements. Thomas settled into his tent as the sun began to set behind the jagged peaks of the surrounding mountain range. The temperature dropped rapidly as the shadows stretched across the creek bed and the sounds of the local bird population went completely silent. Thomas started a small fire using dry wood he gathered from the perimeter of his camp to maintain some level of visibility. He felt a persistent sensation of being watched from the dark tree line, but he attributed the feeling to the isolation of the deep woods. Archived notes from a forestry survey conducted in 2012 mentioned that the acoustics in this valley could create strange echoes. Thomas finished his meal and extinguished the fire before retreating into the safety of his reinforced nylon tent for the evening. The silence of the high wilderness was interrupted by what Thomas described as rhythmic thudding sounds originating from the heavy brush nearby. He remained inside his sleeping bag while observing the thin fabric of the tent for any signs of external movement or shadows. County files from 2016 contain a brief statement from a witness who claimed to hear unusual vocalizations in that general area. These accounts were never confirmed by local authorities who searched the site for evidence of large predators or unauthorized human encampments. Thomas stayed awake for several hours while the sounds continued to move in a slow circle around his immediate campsite. At approximately 2 in the morning, the rhythmic thudding stopped and was replaced by the sound of heavy objects being dragged across the rocky soil. Thomas reached for his flashlight, but he hesitated to turn it on because he did not want to reveal his exact position. The dragging sound moved toward the creek and then circled back toward the rear of the tent where his food bag hung. Dispatch logs from that night showed no other hikers were registered in that specific 5-mile radius of the wilderness area. The unknown entity seemed to move with a calculated precision that did not match the typical scavenging patterns of a black bear. Thomas gripped his small folding knife while listening to the sound of heavy breathing just a few feet from his head. As the first light of dawn appeared, the sounds abruptly ceased, and Thomas emerged from his tent to inspect the surrounding perimeter. He reportedly found several heavy stones that had been moved from the creek bed and placed in a straight line near his gear. Some locals claimed that this behavior matched historical reports of territorial displays by individuals living off the grid in the deep woods. Investigators found no physical evidence of footprints or clothing fibers that would link a specific person to the disturbed rocks or noise. Thomas decided to abandon his original plan and began a rapid descent toward the nearest access road several miles away, is less than ℏ. 0 hash is greater than. The descent was complicated by a thick layer of mountain fog that reduced visibility to less than 10 feet in every direction. Thomas struggled to keep his bearings as the trail seemed to weave through sections of the forest that he did not recognize. The county files from 2009 mentioned a similar case of a hiker who became lost when the trail markers vanished. He checked his compass multiple times only to find that the needle was spinning erratically near certain rock formations in the gorge. This phenomenon was noted in state records as being caused by high iron content in the local subterranean mineral deposits. Thomas pushed forward through the gray mist while hearing the faint sound of snapping branches behind him. The trek back to the trailhead required Thomas to pass through a narrow gorge where the trail was frequently obscured by fallen hemlock trees. He noticed that the trail markers appeared to have been scraped away from the bark of the trees with a sharp instrument. Dispatch logs from that week showed that a maintenance crew had verified the markers were intact only 3 days prior to his arrival. Records conflict regarding whether the damage was caused by environmental factors or intentional tampering by an unidentified individual in the forest. Thomas reached his vehicle in the late afternoon and immediately contacted the local ranger station to report the anomalies. Search teams later surveyed the gorge, but they could not find any tools or evidence of a person residing in that sector. The official report remains open because state records cannot explain the rapid removal of the trail markers over such a large distance. Thomas never returned to that specific region of Appalachia, and he chose to hike in more populated state parks in the years following. The events of 2016 are still discussed by some hikers who frequent the Damascus area, but the facts remain largely inconclusive. Investigators never confirmed the source of the rhythmic sounds or the purpose of the stones moved during the night. The archived notes from the subsequent investigation included a testimony from a neighboring landowner who resided 5 miles from the trailhead. This individual reported seeing unidentified lights moving along the ridgeline during the same 48-hour period that Thomas was in the woods. County files from 2016 do not include any record of authorized search and rescue operations or aerial surveys that would account for the lights. Forensic analysts examined the stones found at the campsite and determined they were sourced from a geological layer located much deeper in the creek bed. This suggested that whoever moved the stones possessed significant physical strength or spent several hours working in total darkness. The case was eventually moved to an inactive status due to a lack of actionable evidence or criminal complaints. State records from 2017 indicate that 2 more hikers reported similar encounters with rhythmic thudding and rearranged forest debris in the same drainage basin. Neither of these individuals were able to provide a visual description of the entity or person responsible for the disturbances. Local law enforcement increased patrols near the Damascus access points for several months, but no unauthorized residents were ever located. Dispatch logs from that period show a series of noise complaints that were dismissed as wind whistling through the limestone caverns. The archive notes conclude that while the experiences were consistent, they lacked the physical proof required for a formal intervention. Thomas remains one of the few witnesses who provided a detailed timeline of the events from that spring weekend. Investigators later reviewed old county file from 2009, which detailed a missing persons case in the same northern sector of the trail. A 24-year-old botanist named Sarah Jenkins had disappeared while collecting plant samples near the limestone gorge. Search and rescue logs from that year indicated that her camp was found completely undisturbed, with all of her gear intact and functional. The only anomaly noted in the state records was a collection of river stones arranged in a geometric pattern inside her tent. Canine units were unable to pick up a scent trail, and the case was eventually labeled as a cold file due to a total lack of physical leads. Thomas noted that the arrangement of stones he found bore a striking resemblance to the descriptions in the archive notes from 2009. Reported sightings of a tall, gaunt figure in the periphery of the woods began to surface in local community forums shortly after the incident with Thomas. These accounts remained largely anecdotal, as no photographic evidence was ever produced to support the claims of the residents. Dispatch logs from 2018 mentioned a series of unexplained thefts from local homesteads involving only heavy iron tools and basic survival supplies. Investigators searched the higher elevations for any signs of a primitive shelter, but the terrain proved too treacherous for a sustained ground operation. Some locals claimed that an individual had been living in the deep caverns beneath the gorge for several decades without detection. These theories were never confirmed by geological surveys, which indicated the cavern systems were mostly inaccessible to human beings. By the winter of 2019, the region was hit by a record-breaking snowstorm that effectively sealed off the Damascus trailhead for several weeks. When the snow melted, local rangers found that a significant portion of the old-growth forest had been marked with the same deep scrapings Thomas reported. County files documented that the scrapings reached heights of nearly 10 feet on some of the larger oak trees in the gorge. This data conflicted with the theory of a typical human vandal, as no ladders or climbing equipment were found in the vicinity. Archived notes from the forestry department suggested that the marks could have been caused by falling ice or wind-blown debris during the intense storm. However, the precision of the marks led many to believe that the cause was intentional and directed toward the existing trail infrastructure. The case remains a point of contention among local historians and wilderness enthusiasts who frequent the southern Appalachian range. State records continue to list the area as a high caution zone for solo hikers due to the persistent history of unexplained mechanical failures and navigational errors. Thomas Miller eventually moved to the Pacific Northwest, where he continued his engineering career, but he reportedly stopped hiking in deep wilderness entirely. He maintained that the sounds he heard in 2016 were not those of a person or an animal he could identify. The mystery of the Damascus Gorge continues to produce occasional reports of rhythmic thudding and rearranged stones to this day. Investigators never confirmed a suspect, and the woods remain as silent and observational as they were during that spring weekend in 2016. In this news story, something watched our campsite all night in the Appalachian Mountains. The Appalachian Mountains hold a history of strange disappearances that the local park rangers rarely discuss with the general public. Griffin Holloway worked as a professional wildlife photographer who specialized in documenting rare bird species in the remote mountain wilderness. He was 34 years old, and he had spent the last decade traveling through the most isolated mountain ranges. In October of 1998, he decided to travel to a remote section of the Blue Ridge Mountains area. His goal for the trip was to photograph the rare northern goshawk during its peak migration through the hardwood forest. He arrived at the trailhead during a particularly cold afternoon when the wind was beginning to howl through the trees. Griffin packed his professional equipment, including a heavy tripod and a specialized long lens for his high-end film camera. He hiked 4 miles into the backcountry before he decided to set up a small camp near a stream. The area was quiet, and the nearest paved road was a full day of hiking away from his current location. He built a small fire and he cooked a simple meal before the sun began to set behind the peaks. As the light faded, he felt a sudden and very distinct sensation that someone was standing just beyond the forest. He turned his flashlight toward the shadows, but he saw only the twisted branches and the thick blankets of moss. Griffin shrugged off the feeling and he climbed into his sleeping bag to get some rest for the early morning. He woke up at 3 a.m. to the sound of something heavy moving slowly around the outer perimeter. The movement was calculated and deliberate, as if the intruder was trying to avoid making any unnecessary noise on the protection. Griffin reached for his flashlight and he sat perfectly still while his heart hammered against his ribs in the dark. He heard a low and gravelly sound that resembled a person trying to clear their throat from a great distance. The photographer slowly unzipped the tent flap and he peered out into the misty clearing where the fire had died. He saw a pair of pale eyes reflecting the moonlight from behind a large oak tree about 20 feet away. The eyes remained perfectly stationary, and they did not blink even when he shone his bright flashlight directly at them. Griffin felt a surge of adrenaline, and he shouted a warning into the darkness to see if anyone would respond. There was no reply from the woods, and the eyes eventually vanished into the thick undergrowth without making a sound. He did not sleep for the rest of the night, and he kept his knife close to his hand until, when the sun finally rose, he began to inspect the area around his tent for any signs of the visitor. He found a set of tracks that looked like bare human feet, but the toes were unusually long and thin. Griffin decided to conduct a formal investigation by setting up a series of motion-activated cameras around the campsite area. He spent the entire afternoon carefully hiding the lenses behind piles of brush and inside the hollow trunks of trees. He used a specialized high-speed film that was designed to capture clear images in very low light conditions indeed. While he was working, he found a discarded leather glove that did not belong to him near the creek bed. The glove was extremely old, and the leather had been stitched together with a material that looked like dried vine. He placed the glove in a plastic bag, and he made a note of the exact location in his journal. That evening, he did not light a fire because he wanted to remain as inconspicuous as possible in the. He sat in his tent with a pair of night vision goggles, and he watched the tree line for movement. At midnight, he saw a group of 3 tall figures emerge from the shadows near the edge of the. They did not move like humans, but they walked with a rhythmic and swaying motion that was very unsettling too. One of the figures approached the spot where he had placed the motion-activated camera, and it stood perfectly still. It reached out a hand that had unusually long fingers, and it gently touched the lens of the expensive camera. The figure was at least 7 feet tall, and it was covered in a layer of matted and gray hair. Griffin realized that these beings were not interested in his food or his supplies, but were curious about his tools. They began to mimic the way he had moved earlier in the day by walking in a slow and deliberate. One of the figures picked up a small rock, and it held the stone to its eye like a camera. Griffin felt a deep sense of dread as he watched the creatures study his behavior with a high level. He realized that they had been watching him since he first entered the woods 3 days ago on the trail. The photographer remained in his tent, and he prayed that the creatures would not decide to enter his small shelter. After an hour of observation, the figures retreated back into the woods, and the forest became eerily silent once again. Griffin waited until the first light of dawn before he gathered his gear and began the long hike back. He moved as quickly as he could, but he constantly looked over his shoulder to see if he was followed. He reached the ranger station in the late afternoon, and he asked to speak with the senior officer on duty. The ranger was a man named Silas Thorne, who had worked in the Appalachian Mountains for over 30 years total. Griffin described the figures and the way they had mimicked his movements during the long night at the remote camp. Silas listened to the story with a grim expression, and he did not seem surprised by the details of the ranger explained that there were several reports of these beings dating back to the late 1800s on Rosette. He referred to them as the observers, and he said they were a group of feral people who lived. According to the archives, the observers did not attack hikers, but they were known for stealing items to use for. Silas showed Griffin a collection of items that had been recovered from abandoned camps over the last few decades of. The collection included rusted cameras and broken binoculars that had been carefully wrapped in animal skins and tied with vines. The ranger warned Griffin that the observers were becoming more bold and were starting to follow people closer to town. Griffin realized that the glove he found was likely a piece of clothing that the beings had tried to. The photographer returned to his home, but he could not stop thinking about the pale eyes in the dark forest. He processed the film from his motion-activated cameras, and he found several clear shots of the tall gray figures. The images showed the beings standing in a circle and looking directly into the camera lens with a curious expression. One of the figures was wearing the leather glove he had found near the creek bed earlier in the day. Griffin decided to share his findings with a local university professor who specialized in Appalachian history and human behavior. The professor examined the photos, and he suggested that the observers were a remnant of an ancient and isolated community. He believed that they had lost the ability to speak, but had developed a highly advanced system of visual mimicry. The university launched a small expedition to the area, but they found no trace of the observers or the. It seemed as though the beings knew they were being hunted, and they had moved deeper into the mountain range. Griffin never returned to that section of the woods, but he still keeps the photos in a locked desk. He sometimes hears a rhythmic tapping on his window at night, and he wonders if they have finally found. The Appalachian Mountains are a place where the past and the present often collide in ways that we cannot understand. Griffin Holloway eventually retired from wildlife photography, and he moved to a quiet town far away from the dark woods. He often tells his story to other hikers as a warning to always be aware of their surroundings. He knows that there are things in the mountains that do not want to be mapped or understood by. The legend of the observers continues to grow, and more people report seeing the pale eyes in the forest. Some people say that the beings are guardians of the wilderness, while others believe they are something much more. The ranger station still keeps a file on the disappearances, but the official cause is always listed as accidental. Griffin believes that the observers are still out there and they are still watching the people who enter the D. He remembers the way the figure held the rock to its eye, and he knows they are still learning. The mountains hold their secrets tightly, and they do not give them up to anyone who is not invited. Every October, he looks at the mountains and he remembers the night he was studied by the Silent Watchers. The investigation into the leather glove revealed that the stitching was made from a rare type of mountain orchid root. This plant only grows in the highest and most inaccessible parts of the mountain range near the rocky peaks. This discovery suggested that the observers had a deep knowledge of the local flora and how to use it. Griffin realized that the beings were far more intelligent than he had initially believed when he first saw them. He spent his final years writing a book about the experience, but he never published the final and most. He died in 2024, and he left his collection of photos to the local historical society in town. The researchers who studied the images found that the observers were often visible in the background of his earlier. It appeared that they had been following him for years before he ever noticed their presence in the dark. This realization changed the way the community viewed the forest and the people who lived in the mountain shadows. The mystery of the Appalachian observers remains unsolved, and the files are still open at the local sheriff office. The town of Blackwood remains a quiet place, but the residents always lock their doors when the sun goes down. They know that the mountains are not just rocks and trees, but are home to something that is still. Silas Thorne occasionally visits the old trailhead, and he leaves a small gift of fruit or cloth on the day. He says it is a way to keep the peace between the town and the beings who live above. Some people laugh at him, but others bring their own offerings to the edge of the dark and thick. The forest seems to accept these gifts, and the number of disappearances has decreased significantly over the last few. Griffin Holloway is buried in a small cemetery that overlooks the peaks he once loved to photograph so much. His headstone has a small carving of a camera and a single pair of eyes watching from the bottom. People who visit the grave often report feeling as though they are being observed from the trees near the prom. It is a fitting tribute to a man who spent his life looking at things that did not want. The Appalachian Mountains continue to stand tall, and they keep their secrets hidden beneath the canopy of the green. The final recording Griffin made before he left the mountains was a simple description of the silence in the coding. He said that the woods were not truly quiet, but were filled with the sound of 1,000 heartbeats. He believed that the mountain was one large organism, and the observers were its eyes and its long ears. This theory was never proven, but it remains a popular topic among the local hunters and the forest rangers. The film from the motion-activated cameras is now stored in a climate-controlled vault to preserve the images. Many people have tried to find the clearing where Griffin camped, but the trails have changed over the years. It seems as though the mountain has moved the path to protect the beings who live in the shadows. Silas Thorne says that some things are not meant to be found by those who do not belong there. He still patrols the lower trails, but he never goes above the ridgeline after the sun is set. He knows that the observers are still there, and they are still waiting for the next person to... The story of the Appalachian Watchers is a reminder that we are never truly alone when we are outside. In this new story, Washington's small-town horror stories that locals never talk about. Sultan, Washington remains a quiet region where the dense evergreens often hide the heavy morning mist in the early fall. Local residents usually avoid discussing the specific events that occurred near the edge of the Skykomish River during 2015. Records from the county sheriff indicate that several calls regarding unexplained activity originated from a single remote property that year. Investigators reportedly found the circumstances surrounding the inhabitants to be highly irregular based on the available dispatch logs from then. The following account details the documented experiences of 3 individuals who encountered something they simply could not easily explain. 32-year-old Mark Miller worked as a local timber surveyor who spent most of his days deep within the woods. He lived in a modest cabin with his younger brother David, who was 24 and worked as a seasonal mechanic. Their friend Sarah joined them during the autumn months to help renovate the aging structure before the harsh winter arrived. The group intended to finish the exterior repairs quickly so they could enjoy the isolation of the Washington wilderness. State records show that Mark had lived in the area for nearly a decade without reporting any significant safety issues. They did not realize that their presence on the property had been noted by someone or something in the brush. The dense forest surrounding the property was comprised of ancient cedar trees that effectively blocked out most of the natural sunlight. Archived notes from a previous land survey conducted in 2010 mentioned that the soil in this region was unusually soft. Mark discovered several sets of deep indentations in the earth that did not match any known wildlife species in the area. Some locals claimed that the property had a history of trespassing issues involving people who lived off the grid nearby. Investigators never confirmed the identity of these individuals because the dense terrain made tracking nearly impossible for the local authorities. The 3 friends began to feel a distinct sense of being watched from the dark shadows of the towering trees. Dispatch logs from late September 2015 indicate that Mark called the sheriff to report a series of loud metallic bangs. He stated that the noises seemed to originate from the corrugated metal roof of the tool shed behind the main cabin. David reportedly inspected the area with a high-powered spotlight, but he saw no one standing in the immediate vicinity. A county file from 2009 describes similar reports of vandalism that were never solved by the responding patrol officers. Sarah noted in her personal journal that the atmosphere on the property had changed from peaceful to something quite oppressive. They decided to install several motion-activated lights around the perimeter to ensure their safety during the long and dark nights. State records from October 2015 showed that the local power grid experienced several unexplained surges, specifically in the Sultan area. Sarah reportedly found that all of the heavy kitchen appliances had been moved several inches away from the wooden walls. She told the investigators that she heard the sound of slow breathing coming from the other side of her door. Records conflict regarding whether there were any signs of forced entry found by the officers who arrived later that evening. Some locals claimed that the cabin was built on top of an old mining shaft that created strange acoustic effects. The group became increasingly paranoid as they realized that their physical environment was being subtly altered by an unknown force. Archive notes from the county coroner mention a discovery of several dead animals that were arranged in a perfect circle. Mark found these remains near the edge of the clearing where he usually parked his heavy-duty timber hauling truck. Investigators never confirmed if the animals had been killed by a predator or if they were placed there by someone. The county file from 2009 mentions that a previous resident had reported finding similar patterns in the high grass. David reportedly began to suffer from severe sleep deprivation because he heard the sound of footsteps on the porch every night. He described the noise as a heavy dragging sound that lasted for several minutes before fading away into the deep woods. Dispatch logs from November 2015 record a second call regarding a security breach in the lower level of the cabin. David reportedly found the heavy iron padlock on the cellar door had been snapped off with a pair of bolt cutters. He told the deputy that nothing appeared to be missing from the storage area despite the door being left wide open. State records indicate that the officers found no fingerprints on the metal surface of the lock or the door handle itself. Some locals claimed that a group of transients was known to use the abandoned mining tunnels for shelter during the winter. Investigators never confirmed this theory because no one was ever located in the subterranean passages beneath the Sultan Forest area. Sarah reportedly captured a single grainy photograph of a figure standing near the tree line during the early hours of the morning. The image shows a tall and thin shape that appears to be wearing a dark hooded coat with no visible face. Archived notes from the sheriff department state that the photograph was too blurry to provide any useful evidence for a search. Records conflict on whether the figure was a physical person or simply a trick of the light among the tall trees. Mark decided to board up the lower windows of the cabin to prevent anyone from looking inside during the night. The three friends stopped leaving the house after the sun went down because the feeling of being hunted became too intense. The final entry in the county file from 2015 describes a massive disturbance that occurred on the 3rd of December. Dispatch logs indicate that a neighbor heard the sound of glass breaking, followed by several loud screams coming from the property. When the officers arrived, they found the front door standing open, and the interior of the cabin was in total disarray. State records show that a significant amount of blood was found on the kitchen floor, but no bodies were ever recovered. Investigators never confirmed the origin of the biological samples because the DNA profiles did not match any of the residents. Some locals claimed that they saw 3 people walking into the river, but these reports were never verified by the police. A massive search party was organized by the local community members who spent 3 weeks combing through the dense evergreen forest. Volunteers reportedly found a single piece of torn clothing that belonged to Sarah snagged on a thick branch near the river. State records indicate that the search was eventually called off due to the arrival of a severe winter storm that year. The investigators found several items of personal value scattered along a trail that led toward the highest peak in the region. Records conflict regarding whether the items were dropped in a hurry or if they were placed as markers for the police. No trace of Mark or David or Sarah was ever found despite the extensive efforts of the local search and rescue teams. The case remains unsolved in the archived notes of the Washington State Police as a mysterious disappearance with no clear motive. The property in Sultan was eventually sold to a private developer who demolished the cabin and cleared the surrounding forest area. County records from 2021 show that no further incidents have been reported on that specific piece of land since. People who live in the region still avoid the area near the Skycomish River when the heavy morning mist rolls in. They reportedly believe that some secrets are better left buried in the soft soil of the deep and dark Washington woods. The true fate of the 3 residents remains one of the greatest mysteries in the history of the small town. In this news story, true terrifying trucker horror stories from America's darkest highways. The Interstate 80 corridor through the state of Wyoming is reportedly known among professional drivers as the most treacherous stretch of road. High winds and sudden ground blizzards often force the state patrol to close the highway for several days during the peak winter. A 54-year-old driver named Frank was hauling a heavy load of timber toward the coast in 1998. He was an experienced veteran of the road who had spent 30 years navigating the steep mountain passes of the western United States. Frank was reportedly attempting to reach the town of Rawlins before a massive cold front descended from the northern Canadian plains. The archived notes from the highway department indicate that the visibility was less than 10 feet when Frank reached the summit pass. The dispatch logs from 1998 show that Frank contacted his home base to report a strange vehicle following his trailer. He noted that a large commercial truck was maintaining a distance of only 5 feet while traveling at nearly 60 miles per hour. This behavior is documented in state records as extremely dangerous given the icy conditions and the lack of visibility on the road. Frank reportedly slowed down to allow the other driver to pass, but the trailing vehicle mirrored his every move on the asphalt. Investigators never confirmed the identity of the other truck because it had no visible markings or license plates on the front bumper. The county file from that year mentions that Frank felt a series of light impacts against the rear of his load is less than has honed. Zero hash is greater than. Some locals claimed that a rogue driver had been harassing long-haul truckers in that region for several weeks during the late 90s. Frank reportedly pulled into a rest area near the town of Laramie to inspect the back of his timber trailer for damage. He found a set of heavy iron chains wrapped around his rear axle that did not belong to his own equipment records. The archived notes from the state police describe the chains as being cold to the touch and covered in a dark residue. Records conflict regarding whether the mysterious truck ever entered the rest area behind Frank or vanished into the swirling white snow. He did not see any tire tracks leading away from his parking spot when he returned to his cab that night. A 42-year-old independent driver named Sarah was transporting refrigerated medical supplies through the Mojave Desert in 2004. She was traveling along the historic Route 66 near the town of Ambient, where the landscape is mostly volcanic rock and sand. Her goal was to deliver the sensitive cargo to a hospital in Arizona before the sunrise could compromise the internal temperature. Sarah reportedly noticed a series of reflective objects scattered across the pavement several miles ahead of her position on the desert road. State records from 2004 indicate that multiple drivers had reported seeing strange debris in that specific area of the highway. She decelerated her vehicle and turned on her high beams to identify the nature of the obstacles in her path. The archived notes from the San Bernardino County Sheriff Department describe the objects as being dozens of vintage porcelain dolls standing upright. Sarah reportedly counted over 50 dolls that were arranged in a perfect circle in the middle of the eastbound lane of traffic. She did not see any other vehicles or people in the surrounding desert while she sat in her idling truck cab. Dispatch logs show that she called for assistance, but the nearest deputy was over 60 miles away from her current location. Some locals claimed that a group of art students often placed installations in the desert, but this was never officially confirmed. Sarah reportedly felt a sense of extreme unease when she noticed that the dolls were all facing toward her door. Investigators never confirmed how the dolls were placed in such a remote area without leaving any footprints in the soft desert sand. Sarah chose to drive off the road and around the display rather than exiting her vehicle to move the strange porcelain figures. She reported that her radio began to emit a high-pitched frequency that lasted until she reached the state line of Arizona. The county file from 2004 mentions that a highway crew arrived at the scene 2 hours later but found nothing. There were no dolls and no signs of a truck driving through the sand or onto the shoulder of the main road. Records conflict on whether Sarah had experienced a visual hallucination caused by the extreme heat or a lack of sleep. In 2012, a 31-year-old driver named Jim was hauling auto parts through the thick woods of northern Maine. He was a rookie driver who was eager to prove his reliability to the logistics company that had recently hired him for work. Jim was driving on Interstate 95 during a quiet Tuesday night when the moon was obscured by a thick layer of clouds. He was reportedly listening to his CB radio to stay awake during the long stretch between the towns of Holton and Bangor. The dispatch logs from 2012 show that Jim was maintaining a steady speed and checking in at regular intervals. He reportedly heard a voice break through the static that sounded exactly like his own voice speaking from the radio. The voice on the radio reportedly began to recite Jim's home address and the names of his family members in a flat tone. Archived notes from the Maine State Police indicate that the transmission did not originate from any known tower or commercial radio base. Jim grew increasingly agitated and tried to change the channel, but the voice followed him to every frequency on the CB unit. Some locals claimed that the iron deposits in the mountains can cause strange interference that mimics human speech in very specific ways. Investigators never confirmed the source of the broadcast or how the speaker obtained personal information about the young driver from Ohio. The county file from 2012 contains a transcript of the strange audio recorded by a hobbyist. Jim reportedly pulled his truck onto the shoulder and disconnected the power to his radio, but the voice continued to speak loudly. He told the county sheriff that he saw a figure standing in his side mirror that looked like his own double. State records conflict on whether any other person was seen on the highway during that time, according to the local traffic cameras. The young driver resigned from his position the following week and refused to drive a commercial vehicle for the rest of life. Many archived notes from the region suggest that the Maine woods hold many secrets that are only revealed to the lone driver. These events remain documented as unexplained anomalies in the state records of the American highway system and the county files. A 47-year-old driver named Leo was hauling a tanker of diesel fuel across the Hoover Dam in 1999. He was a veteran of the desert roads who understood the risks of driving through the mountainous terrain of northern Arizona. Leo was reportedly traveling toward the city of Las Vegas to deliver his cargo before the morning rush of the tourist. The dispatch logs from 1999 show that Leo reported a group of people standing on the narrow bridge walkway. He noted that the individuals were dressed in formal attire that appeared to be from the 1920s or the early 30s. Some locals claimed that the bridge is a site of many historical sightings that have never been fully explained. The archived notes from the National Park Service mention that the security cameras did not capture any pedestrians on the bridge. Leo reportedly saw the group of people turn their heads in unison to watch his truck pass through the concrete canyon walls. He told the investigators that the individuals had pale skin that seemed to glow under the yellow glare of the highway lamps. State records conflict regarding whether anyone was authorized to be on the bridge during the late hours of that specific Tuesday. Leo continued his drive, but he reportedly saw the same group of people standing on the shoulder 10 miles ahead. The county file from 1999 describes his statement as being consistent with someone who experienced a significant event. In 2018, a 38-year-old driver named Elena was transporting a load of antique furniture through West Texas. She was driving on Interstate 10, where the flat landscape stretches for hundreds of miles between the small towns and gas stations. Elena intended to reach the city of El Paso before the sun began to bake the desert floor in the morning. She reportedly noticed a flickering light in the distance that appeared to be a distress signal from a stranded motorist nearby. State records from 2018 indicate that there were no reported accidents or breakdowns on that stretch of the road. Elena slowed her vehicle and prepared to stop when she saw a massive structure appearing in the middle of lanes. The archive notes describe the structure as a large wooden house that was sitting directly on the asphalt of the interstate highway. Elena reportedly slammed on her brakes and came to a halt only 20 feet from the front porch of the building. She did not see any trucks or trailers that could have transported a house to such a remote location in Texas. Dispatch logs show that she contacted the highway patrol to report the obstruction, but they found nothing when they arrived later. Some locals claimed that the mirages in the desert can create images of buildings that are located hundreds of miles away. Investigators never confirmed how a physical object could vanish from the road without leaving any marks on the hot pavement. A 50-year-old driver named Michael was hauling a load of luxury cars through the Everglades on Interstate 75 inches 1980. He was a seasoned professional who was used to the humidity and the thick fog that often blankets the Florida swamp. Michael was reportedly traveling south toward the city of Miami when his headlights revealed a barrier of thick vines across the road. The state records from 1980 describe several incidents where the local vegetation appeared to grow over the highway overnight in certain areas. He stopped his truck and stepped out to inspect the barrier, which seemed to be made of ancient oak and moss. Archive notes from the county file suggest that the wood was not native to the southern state. Michael reportedly heard a sound like heavy breathing coming from the darkness of the cypress trees on either side of the highway. He noted that the air was filled with a scent that resembled old wet paper and rotting flowers from the deep marsh. Some locals claimed that the swamp has a way of reclaiming the land that was taken by the construction of the roads. Investigators never confirmed the presence of the wooden barrier because it was gone by the time the patrol arrived at the scene. Records conflict regarding whether Michael had accidentally driven onto an abandoned access road that was no longer in use by the public. He reportedly refused to drive through the Everglades at night for the remainder of his long career is less than has Hone. Zero hash is greater than. A 29-year-old driver named David was transporting industrial chemicals through the plains of Kansas in 2017. He was driving on Interstate 70 during a period of intense heat that had caused the pavement to ripple and crack. David was reportedly checking his side mirrors when he noticed that his trailer appeared to be dissolving into a liquid state. The dispatch logs from 2017 indicate that he called his dispatcher in a state of extreme panic and confusion. He noted that the metal of the tank was dripping onto the road, but the pressure gauges remained perfectly stable. Some locals claimed that the extreme heat in Kansas can cause the eyes to perceive solid objects as melting or shifting. The archived notes from the State Highway Patrol mention that David pulled over and found his trailer was completely intact and dry. He told the officers that he had seen a figure dressed in a hazmat suit standing on top of his moving tank. Investigators never confirmed the presence of any other person on the vehicle during the time that David was driving on the road. State records conflict on whether there were any chemical leaks reported in the county during the month of July that year. David reportedly quit his job and moved to a different state where he no longer had to drive through the open plains. The county file from 2017 remains open as an unexplained case of mass visual distortion on the interstate. A 45-year-old mail hauler named Rebecca was driving through the mountain passes of Oregon in 2006. She was traveling on Interstate 5 during a heavy rainstorm that had caused several small mudslides on the steep highway banks. Rebecca was reportedly approaching a tunnel when she saw a man standing on the roof of the concrete entrance structure. The dispatch logs from 2006 show that she reported a possible jumper to the local emergency services immediately. She noted that the man was wearing a dark suit and holding an umbrella despite the high winds in the pass. Some locals claimed that a former highway engineer had been seen in the area many times after his retirement. The archived notes from the state police indicate that they searched the tunnel roof but found no evidence of a person. Rebecca told the investigators that the man had looked directly into her cab and smiled as she drove into the darkness. Records conflict on whether anyone had been reported missing from the nearby towns during the week of the strange sighting. She reportedly found a small wet business card on her dashboard the next morning that had no name or phone number. Investigators never confirmed how the card could have entered the locked truck while Rebecca was sleeping at the rest stop. The county file from 2006 mentions that several other drivers had seen a similar figure near the tunnel entrance. In 1992, a 34-year-old driver named Stephen was hauling grain through the rural hills of Pennsylvania. He was driving on a secondary road that was known for its sharp turns and lack of lighting during the night. Stephen was reportedly passing an old farmhouse when he saw all of the lights in the building turn off at once. The state records from 1992 indicate that there were no power outages reported in that specific part of the county. He noted that a large black dog began to run alongside his truck and kept pace even at 50 miles per hour. Some locals claimed that a pack of wild dogs had been roaming the hills and preying on local livestock. The archive notes from the sheriff department describe the dog as being much larger than any known breed in the United States. Stephen reportedly felt the truck shudder as if something had jumped onto the roof of the cab while he was moving. He did not stop his vehicle until he reached a well-lit gas station 3 towns away from the farmhouse location. Investigators never confirmed the presence of any animal tracks on the roof of the truck or on the road surface. Records conflict regarding whether the farmhouse was even occupied during the time that Stephen was driving past the property that night. The county file from 1992 remains a popular topic of conversation among the local residents and the drivers. A 52-year-old driver named Gary was hauling a load of steel pipe through the state of Montana in 2010. He was traveling on Highway 2 during a night when the aurora borealis was visible in the clear northern sky above. Gary was reportedly mesmerized by the lights when he noticed that his truck was no longer making any sound on the road. The dispatch logs from 2010 show that his GPS coordinates remained fixed in one position for over 20 minutes. He noted that the steering wheel felt light and the engine temperature dropped to 0 while he was still moving forward. Some locals claimed that the magnetic fields in that region can interfere with the operation of heavy machinery and electronics. The archive notes from the State Patrol indicate that Gary was found parked in the middle of a field 5 miles away. He told the investigators that he had simply followed the green lights in the sky until the road vanished beneath him. Records conflict on how the truck could have crossed a deep ditch and a fence without causing any damage to the vehicle. Investigators never confirmed the source of the magnetic interference or the reason for the total silence that Gary had reportedly experienced. The county file from 2010 contains a statement from a mechanic who found no faults with the truck or the engine. Gary reportedly retired from the road and moved to a city where the sky was always hidden by the lights. In this new story, true scary February snowstorm horror stories that still haunt survivors. In February 2012, 28-year-old park ranger Elias Thorne navigated the dense tree line of the Cascade Mountains alone. He was stationed at a remote outpost to monitor snowpack levels before a predicted record-breaking atmospheric river event occurred. Elias was an experienced outdoorsman who understood the physical risks of isolation during severe Pacific Northwest winter weather patterns daily. State records indicate that the temperature dropped 40 degrees in less than 3 hours as the massive storm front arrived. The sudden shift in pressure reportedly caused several electronic instruments inside the ranger station to malfunction without any logical warning. Investigators never confirmed why the emergency radio remained silent during the most critical hours of the initial freezing whiteout event. The wind outside reached 80 miles per hour, which stripped the thick bark from the ancient pine trees surrounding the cabin. Elias noted in his logs that the sound resembled human screaming, but he attributed this to the gale force wind. According to archive notes found later, he spent the evening reinforcing the heavy wooden shutters against the mounting heavy snow. Some locals claimed that this specific region was prone to strange acoustic anomalies during high-altitude pressure drops in winter. Records conflict regarding whether Elias was alone or if a secondary traveler had sought shelter at the station gate area. The county file from 2012 describes a series of heavy, rhythmic thuds against the reinforced front door that night. When the primary generator failed, Elias had to rely on a small kerosene lamp to maintain visibility inside the freezing room. He reportedly saw a figure standing motionless in the middle of the clearing through a small gap in the shutters. Dispatch logs show that no other rangers were within 50 miles of his location due to the extreme road conditions. The figure did not move for 4 hours despite the sub-zero temperatures and the blinding horizontal sheets of falling ice. Elias wrote that the person seemed to be wearing a summer uniform, which was logically impossible given the environment conditions. State records show that no missing persons reports were filed for that specific area during the month of February snows. By the morning of the second day, the snow had completely buried the first floor of the small mountain outpost building. Elias attempted to dig a tunnel toward the equipment shed, but he found the snow was packed with unnatural density. He discovered a set of barefoot prints leading away from his door into the center of the frozen forest floor. Investigators never confirmed how a human could survive those conditions without thermal gear or even basic leather winter boots today. The archived notes mentioned that Elias found his own name carved into the ice on the inside of the glass. There is no official explanation for how the frost formed into specific English characters during the peak of the storm. Elias spent the next 6 hours monitoring the barometer, which continued to drop into ranges rarely seen in Washington state history. He reportedly heard a series of voices whispering from the ventilation shafts despite being alone in a soundproof metal bunker. County files from 2012 indicate that the ranger station was designed to withstand much higher wind loads than recorded. Investigators never confirmed if the structural groaning was the result of the storm or something moving across the roof. Elias wrote in his final log entry that the shadow outside had moved closer to the thick, reinforced window pane. Some locals claimed that the pressure caused hallucinations, but the physical marks on the glass suggested a more solid presence. The search and rescue teams arrived 3 days later once the atmospheric river had finally moved toward the Idaho border. They found the station completely encased in a layer of black ice that required heavy industrial tools to break through. Dispatch logs show that the interior of the station was perfectly preserved, but Elias was nowhere to be found today. There were no signs of a struggle, and his cold weather gear was still hanging neatly by the kitchen stove. The county file from 2012 mentions that a single set of wet footprints led into the basement area alone. Records conflict on whether the basement door was locked from the inside or the outside when the team arrived. In February 2015, 24-year-old Sarah Miller was driving through the Oregon wilderness during a massive blizzard. She was a freelance journalist traveling to a small town to document the effects of the prolonged drought on locals. According to state records, Sarah was reported missing by her editor after she failed to check in from her hotel. Dispatch logs indicate that her vehicle was found abandoned on a Forest Service road that was not on any map. The car was running, and the heater was set to the highest possible temperature setting despite the empty driver's seat. Investigators never confirmed why she would leave a warm vehicle to walk into a blizzard without a heavy coat. The digital images on the camera showed a series of blurred shapes moving through the trees during the heavy snowfall. Some locals claimed that the shapes resembled tall, thin figures with elongated limbs that did not match any local wildlife. Archived notes from the investigation describe a strange humming sound that was captured on the final video file found later. Records conflict regarding the presence of footprints around the car because the wind had scoured the ground to the dirt. Sarah reportedly left a voicemail for her mother that consisted entirely of rhythmic tapping sounds in a specific sequence pattern. Investigators never confirmed if the tapping was a form of code or simply interference from the collapsing cell towers. A local hunter found a red scarf snagged on a branch near the summit of a peak called the Devil's Backbone. The county file from 2015 confirms that the scarf belonged to Sarah and was stained with strange gray ash. Some locals claimed that the area was a site of frequent magnetic disturbances that caused compasses to spin wildly today. Investigators never confirmed if Sarah had become disoriented by the whiteout conditions or if she was following a path. Archive notes mention that the search dogs refused to enter the dense thicket where the scarf was located that afternoon. State records show that the search was called off after 12 days due to another incoming storm system arriving. In February 2019, a group of 3 college students went missing while camping in the remote Appalachian Mountains area. They were 21-year-old Mark, 20-year-old Chloe, and 22-year-old David studying local geology. According to state records, they had obtained a permit to collect rock samples from a specific limestone cave system there. Dispatch logs show that their last communication was a text message sent to a friend at midnight on Friday night. The message reportedly contained only a single word, which was the name of a town that no longer existed today. Investigators never confirmed how the students reached the deep interior of the forest, given the deep snowdrifts present. Inside the tent, investigators found 3 sets of sleeping bags that had been arranged in a perfect triangle formation tonight. Records conflict on whether the students had time to put on their boots before fleeing into the freezing night air. Some locals claimed that the limestone caves acted as a natural amplifier for subsonic frequencies that caused intense panic attacks. Archive notes from the search team state that they heard the sound of children laughing deep within the rock walls. Investigators never confirmed the source of the laughter since there were no families living within 20 miles of the site. State records show that David's glasses were found resting on a ledge 50 feet above the ground level, clearly. By the time the snow melted in April, a hiker discovered a backpack hanging from a high branch near cave. The backpack contained a journal with entries that stopped abruptly on the night the storm began in February 2019. The final page contained a detailed drawing of a face with no eyes or mouth looking through a window glass. Some locals claimed that this image matched old folklore stories from the region about the entities of the frost. Investigators never confirmed the identity of the person who drew the image, since the handwriting was completely illegible today. The county file from 2019 remains one of the most mysterious disappearances in the history of the park. In this news story, true scary stories of growing up in Appalachia they never warned us about. The Appalachian mountain range contains thousands of square miles of dense forest and deep valleys that remain largely unexplored today. Many residents of these isolated communities prefer to avoid the high ridges and deep hollows when the sun goes down. Jacob Miller was a 25-year-old surveyor who graduated from a technical college in the year 2012. He accepted a contract to map the boundaries of a large timber property located in the heart of Logan County. His objective involved placing physical markers every 50 feet to define the limits of a future logging operation site. State records from 2015 indicate that the project was part of a larger economic development plan for the region. The valley known as Black Hollow earned its name because the steep mountain walls blocked the light for most day. Archived notes from the 1920s describe the area as a place where the air remains cold even in July. Jacob drove his heavy truck through several small towns where the locals watched him with a sense of quiet suspicion. He reached the end of a gravel road and parked his vehicle near a rusted gate that was locked shut. Reportedly, the local utility companies refused to service the hollow due to the frequent equipment failures and the rough terrain. Jacob checked his radio and noted that he was already losing the signal from the nearest tower in the city. State records mentioned that the last official residence in the hollow was a small homestead that burned in 1970. Dispatch logs from that year recorded a series of strange sightings by the fire crews who responded to the scene. Investigators never confirmed the cause of the fire, and the county file from 2009 noted the case closed. Some locals claimed that the fire was set intentionally to drive out a family that refused to sell their land. Records conflict regarding the names of the victims, but the stories of the tragedy persisted in the local folklore area. Jacob ignored the local legends and focused on the technical requirements of the surveying job he needed to finish today. The hike into the center of the hollow took over 2 hours because the undergrowth was thick with thorny vines. Jacob carried a heavy pack filled with iron pins and a sledgehammer along with his digital GPS tracking device unit. He noticed that the forest was strangely quiet, and even the common birds of West Virginia seemed to be absent. The ground was covered in a thick layer of damp leaves that muffled the sound of his heavy leather boots. He reached the first corner of the property and began searching for the original boundary marker from 1924. He found a rusted piece of metal protruding from the base of a massive oak tree that looked very ancient. Jacob set up his tripod and began the process of verifying the coordinates using the satellite data on his screen. He noticed that his GPS unit was fluctuating wildly and gave him readings that were several hundred feet off target. Reportedly, the geological composition of the Appalachian Mountains can sometimes interfere with electronic signals during the summer months here. He decided to rely on his compass and the physical descriptions found in the old county files for his work. A sudden sound of a heavy branch snapping nearby caused him to pause and reach for the bear spray on belt. He scanned the trees but saw nothing except for the swaying leaves and the shifting shadows of the deep forest. As he moved deeper into the hollow, he stumbled upon the remains of a log structure hidden behind some brush. The cabin was built in the style of the early 1900s with a stone chimney that was mostly collapsed. Archived notes from the Historical Society suggested that this was the site of a failed mining office from 2011. Jacob walked toward the open doorway and saw that the interior was filled with rotted furniture and old rusted cans. He saw a series of strange markings carved into the wooden door frame that looked like a tally of days. Some locals claimed that a hermit lived in this cabin until his disappearance in the winter of 24. He stepped inside the cabin to escape a sudden downpour of rain that began to fall from the gray sky. The air inside smelled of damp earth and old coal smoke, which felt very oppressive in the small, cramped space. He found a handwritten ledger on the floor that contained names and dates from the year 2009. Dispatch logs from that period mentioned a search for a missing hiker who was last seen near this cabin site. Investigators never confirmed if the ledger belonged to the missing man or a squatter who was living in the woods. Jacob took a photo of the ledger and prepared to leave as the rain began to taper off outside now. A low humming sound began to vibrate through the walls of the cabin and caused Jacob to feel very nauseous. He recognized the sound as an acoustic anomaly often reported in deep valleys where the wind hits the rock faces. County records from 2016 include several testimonies from park rangers who experienced similar physical sensations in the area. Jacob walked back into the clearing and saw that his survey tripod had been knocked over on the wet ground. He was certain that he had been alone in the woods, but the damage to his equipment suggested otherwise today. He carefully inspected the area for tracks, but the damp leaves made it impossible to see any clear footprints there. He heard a sharp whistle coming from the ridge above the cabin that sounded exactly like a human signal call. Jacob shouted a greeting into the forest, but the only response was the rhythmic tapping of wood against a tree. Some archived notes from the regional forestry department mentioned that timber poachers used these signals to communicate with each other. He decided to pack his gear and move toward the secondary survey site located on the eastern slope of hill. The feeling of being watched intensified as he climbed the steep terrain and moved away from the old log cabin. He kept his head down and focused on the path while checking his watch every few minutes to track time. He found a series of deep trenches that were dug into the hillside and lined with heavy pieces of plastic. State records from 2003 mentioned that illegal excavations were common in areas with potential for gold or gems. Jacob saw fresh cigarette butts near the edge of the trench, which indicated that someone was here very recently today. He realized that he might be encroaching on an active illegal mining operation that was not authorized by the state. Reportedly, these groups can be very protective of their sites and often use intimidation to keep strangers away from area. He began to back away from the trenches while trying to remain as quiet as possible in the thick brush. He saw a small pile of personal items near a tree that included a pair of child shoes and glasses. The county file from 2009 mentioned that a family vanished from a nearby campsite without leaving a trace. Investigators never confirmed if the items were connected to the missing family or if they were just discarded mountain trash. Jacob felt a surge of adrenaline as he realized the danger of his situation in this remote part of Hollow. He turned to walk back the way he came and saw a figure standing silently on the trail ahead of. The person was wearing a heavy, dark coat and a wide-brimmed hat that obscured their face from his view. Jacob stopped and raised his hands to show that he was not a threat to the person on the trail. He explained that he was a surveyor for the state and was only here to map the boundaries of property. The figure did not respond and simply pointed toward the ridge before turning and walking back into the dense trees. Records conflict regarding the presence of any registered residents in this specific section of the Logan County forest land. Jacob waited for several minutes until he was sure the stranger was gone before he continued down the narrow path. He felt his heart racing in his chest as he realized how isolated he truly was from any outside help. The sun began to drop behind the mountain peaks and cast long and distorted shadows across the forest floor today. Jacob knew that he could not navigate the terrain in the dark and needed to find a safe place soon. He found a small rock overhang that offered some protection from the elements and the wind blowing from the north. He sat with his back against the stone and kept his flashlight off to avoid drawing attention to his location. Some locals claimed that the woods come alive at night with sounds that have no logical explanation for the people. He heard a series of heavy thuds that sounded like someone was dropping large rocks into the deep valley below. He used his flashlight briefly to check his map and saw a trail that was not listed on any document. Archived notes from the 1950s mentioned a secret road used by moonshiners during the era of the Prohibition laws. He decided to follow the trail in the morning because it appeared to lead directly toward the main highway exit. The sound of a metallic scraping began again and seemed to be coming from the woods directly above his head. Jacob stayed awake for most of the night and listened to the strange noises that echoed through the dark hollow. He felt a deep sense of dread that he could not explain despite his professional training and his personal experience. The first light of dawn revealed a heavy mist that clung to the trees and made visibility very difficult today. Jacob gathered his belongings and started walking down the secret trail while keeping a hand on his heavy survey equipment. He found a rusted metal sign that was nailed to a tree and written in a language he did not. Dispatch logs from 2012 recorded a similar report of a strange sign found by a group of local hikers. Investigators never confirmed the meaning of the sign and suggested it was a prank by some local high school students. Jacob reached a clearing and saw his truck parked in the distance, which gave him a great sense of relief. When he reached his vehicle, he saw that the tires had been slashed and the windshield was smashed with rocks. He checked the interior of the truck and found that nothing was stolen, including his expensive laptop and his radio. Reportedly, the act of vandalism was a clear warning to leave the area and never return to the Black Hollow. He used his satellite phone to call for help and waited for the local police to arrive at his location. State records from 2015 show that the police response was delayed by several hours due to a fallen tree. Jacob sat on the ground and watched the forest with a sense of defeat as the rain began to fall. Two officers from the Logan County Sheriff Department arrived in a heavy four-wheel drive vehicle to help him today. They took a statement from Jacob and examined the damage to his truck with a look of bored and indifference. The county file from 2009 mentioned that vandalism was common in the remote parts of the mountain range. Jacob told them about the cabin and the figure he saw on the trail, but the officers simply shook heads. Some locals claimed that the police were aware of the illegal activities in the hollow, but chose to ignore them. He felt that they were not telling him everything they knew about the history of the Black Hollow and its residents. The survey project was officially suspended by the timber company 2 weeks after Jacob returned to the main office today. State records from 2016 indicate that the land was sold to an anonymous buyer who requested no further maps. Jacob never received an explanation for the sudden change in plans, and he was assigned to a different project site. He still has the photos of the ledger and the strange markings he found on the door of the cabin. Investigators never confirmed any of his claims, and the case of the vanished family remains an open and cold file. He sometimes thinks about the figure on the trail and wonders if they were trying to help or to hurt. Jacob Miller moved out of West Virginia in the year 2017 to work in the flatter terrain of Ohio. He avoids the woods and the mountains because the sound of breaking branches still makes him feel very uneasy now. Archived notes from the local newspaper mentioned that several more sightings of the figure occurred in 2018 and 19. Records conflict regarding the current status of the Black Hollow, but many people say it is a cursed place today. Jacob knows that the truth is likely much more mundane, but no less terrifying than any ghost or monster story. The Appalachian Mountains will continue to keep their secrets hidden in the deep hollows and the shadows of the forest. Before Jacob entered the woods, he stopped at a small gas station to buy some water and some trail snacks. The elderly woman behind the counter saw his survey maps and warned him to be careful near the old creek. She mentioned that her grandfather used to work in the mines until the day he saw something in the dark. Reportedly, the man never spoke another word for the rest of his life and died in the year 1960. Jacob dismissed her story as a local superstition designed to frighten outsiders who came to work on the mountain today. He now realizes that the warning was based on a very real and present danger that he did not understand. The survey pins were made of galvanized steel and were designed to last for at least 100 years in soil. Jacob recorded the serial numbers of each pin in his logbook to ensure that the data was accurate and verifiable. County records from 2012 showed that many pins from the original 1924 survey were missing or moved. Some archive notes suggested that the movement of the earth was responsible for the displacement of the boundary markers there. Jacob found it hard to believe that nature could move a heavy steel rod several feet without leaving any tracks. He suspected that someone was moving the markers to change the size of the property for their own personal gain. Dispatch logs from 2015 recorded a call from a woman who lived on the edge of the Logan County. She claimed that her dog would bark at the trees for hours every night until it finally disappeared in June. Investigators never confirmed if a predator was responsible or if the dog had simply run away into the deep woods. Jacob thought about this report as he sat in his truck and waited for the police to arrive at site. He wondered if the figure he saw on the trail had anything to do with the disappearance of the local. The silence of the mountain felt like a heavy weight that was pressing down on his chest and his mind. There are many stories like this one that come from the heart of the Appalachian Mountains every single year now. Most of them are dismissed as urban legends or the result of too much isolation in the deep wilderness areas. State records and county files provide a glimpse into the reality of the events, but they never tell the whole. Jacob Miller still dreams of the metallic scraping sound and the feeling of eyes watching him from the dark trees. He will never return to the Black Hollow, and he advises others to stay away from the deep Appalachian woods. The truth remains hidden in the archives and the memories of the few people who were brave enough to enter. In this new story, a missing hiker case that changed a small West Virginia town forever. Small mountain communities often keep their secrets tucked away in the dense woods until a single person goes missing suddenly. The quiet town of Blackwood sat right on the edge of the Monongahela forest, where the trees grew very thick. Silas Thorne had worked as a lead ranger for the National Forest for over 25 years in West Virginia. He knew every single acre of the rugged land, and he respected the dangers that lived within the deep shadows. The autumn of 1994 brought a sudden cold snap that turned the green leaves into brittle brown shapes. A freelance cartographer named Elias Vance arrived in the town during the first week of October to map the ridge. Elias was 28 years old, and he had a reputation for being extremely thorough with his topographical surveys lately. He checked into the Pinecrest Motel and told the manager he would be back before the first heavy snow. Silas met the young man at the ranger station to provide him with the necessary permits for the backcountry. Elias carried a heavy pack filled with expensive survey equipment and enough food to last him for at least 10 days. He planned to hike toward a remote area known as Dead Man's Drop, which few people ever bothered to visit. Silas warned him that the weather could turn dangerous quickly, but Elias just smiled and said he liked the solitude. The young man seemed very confident in his abilities, and he possessed a map that was incredibly detailed and old. Silas watched the cartographer disappear into the tree line, and he felt a strange sense of unease in his chest. The first week of the expedition passed without any issues, and the weather remained remarkably clear and quite sunny for October. Elias was expected to return to the town by the 20th of the month to submit his preliminary survey findings. When the 21st of October arrived without any sign of the young man, the motel manager contacted the authorities. Silas organized a search party consisting of local volunteers and several experienced deputies from the nearby sheriff office in town. They started their investigation at the trailhead where the old blue truck belonging to Elias was still parked and abandoned. The vehicle was covered in a thick layer of pine needles, and the interior appeared to be completely undisturbed by anyone. Silas found a set of spare keys hidden in the wheel well, and he opened the door to check the glove box. Inside, he found a journal that contained several entries about the unusual geological features of the northern ridge and the cliffs. Elias wrote that the compass readings in the area near Dead Man's Drop were becoming increasingly erratic and very difficult. The search party began the long hike into the wilderness, while a light rain started to fall from the gray clouds. They followed the marked trail for 3 miles before they reached the point where Elias had planned to go off. Silas noticed that the undergrowth in this part of the forest was unusually thick, and it looked very dark indeed. The searchers moved in a grid pattern, and they shouted the name of the missing man into the cold mountain air. They found the first significant clue near a shallow creek about 5 miles into the dense and very unforgiving mountain brush. A bright orange survey marker was tied to a low branch, but it had been shredded by something with claws. Silas knelt down to examine the damp ground, and he noticed several deep impressions that did not look like footprints. These marks were elongated, and they seemed to sink deep into the mud, as if the creature was very heavy. The search party pushed deeper into the wilderness as the sun began to dip below the jagged horizon of peaks. They reached the base of Dead Man's Drop just as a light dusting of snow started to coat the ground. One of the volunteers shouted when he spotted a dark shape huddled beneath a natural rock overhang near the cliff. It was the heavy backpack that belonged to Elias Vance, but the young man was nowhere to be found nearby. Silas approached the pack with caution, and he noticed that the straps had been sliced with a very sharp blade. The contents of the bag were scattered across the frozen ground, and it looked like someone had been searching through. Silas gathered the items and he found that most of the food was still inside and neatly wrapped in plastic. The most important discovery was a small handheld cassette recorder that Elias used to take notes while he was working. Silas pressed the play button and listened to the voice of the young man as it echoed through the air. The early recordings were standard descriptions of rock formations and elevation changes that sounded very professional and quite calm indeed. However, the tone of the voice changed significantly on the final entry, which was dated October the 14th of that year. Elias sounded breathless, and he whispered into the microphone about a cabin that was not supposed to be on maps. He described a structure made of gray stones that seemed to blend perfectly into the side of the steep mountain. According to the recording, the cabin had no windows and the heavy wooden door was sealed shut with iron bolts. Elias said he heard a rhythmic tapping coming from inside the stone walls that sounded like a person using hammers. He decided to wait nearby to see if anyone would come out of the strange building before the sun set. The recording ended abruptly with a loud metallic clatter and the sound of heavy boots running over very dry leaves. The search party spent the next 2 days looking for the stone cabin, but they found absolutely nothing in area. Silas studied the topographical maps and realized that the coordinates Elias mentioned led to a sheer cliff face with no ledge. He returned to the site where they found the backpack and began to clear away the snow with his hands. He discovered a series of narrow grooves carved into the rock that looked like they had been made by fingers. These grooves led toward a hidden crevice in the mountainside that was barely wide enough for a man to enter. Silas squeezed through the opening and found himself in a small, natural cavern that felt surprisingly warm despite the weather. The walls were covered in charcoal drawings of the surrounding forest and detailed maps of the town of Blackwood below. In the center of the cave sat a pile of survey equipment that had been smashed into hundreds of pieces. Silas found a final notebook page tucked into a crack in the stone wall that contained a single sentence. It stated that the mountain was not made of rock, but of something that was still breathing and hungry. The search for Elias Vance was officially called off after a massive blizzard buried the entire ridge under snow. Silas spent his final days as a ranger reviewing the dispatch logs from the night Elias recorded his final message. He discovered that several residents of Blackwood had reported hearing a strange rhythmic tapping coming from the floorboards of homes. These reports were dismissed at the time as settling foundations or the sound of woodpeckers in the nearby forest trees. Silas realized that the tapping Elias heard in the mountains was the same sound that was haunting the town below. He revisited the cavern one last time before he retired, but the entrance had been sealed by a rock slide. The maps that Elias had drawn on the cave walls suggested that the mountain was slowly expanding toward the town. Silas noticed that the distances between the trees near the trailhead were slightly different than they were 10 years ago. It seemed as though the earth itself was stretching and moving in a way that defied all known laws of. The disappearance of the young cartographer remained a cold case, and the files were eventually moved to a dusty basement. The town of Blackwood tried to move on from the tragedy, but the residents never quite felt safe in homes. Every year on the anniversary of the disappearance, the local sheriff noticed an increase in reports of strange tapping sounds. The town of Blackwood was never the same after the disappearance of the young man who came to Map Wilderness. People started locking their doors at night, and parents told their children to stay away from the edge of woods. Silas Thorne retired from the ranger service a year later because he could not stop thinking about the rhythmic tapping. He moved to a different state, but he still kept a copy of the final recording in a desk. Some of the locals claimed they saw a figure watching the town from the high ridges during the cold months. These witnesses described a tall man who carried a survey pole and moved with a strange and very jerky gait. No body was ever recovered, and the stone cabin remained a mystery that the mountain refused to give up. The disappearance of Elias Vance became a local legend that served as a grim reminder of the power of nature. Some things are simply not meant to be mapped or understood by the people who live in the world. The Monongahela forest continues to grow over the old trails, and the secrets of the ridge remain buried in time. Silas often wondered if Elias was still out there somewhere tapping on the stones of a cabin that lived. He knew that some mysteries are better left alone in the dark corners of the world where the wind. The case remains open in the dusty files of the sheriff's office, but no new evidence has ever been. Every October, the people of Blackwood remember the cartographer who vanished into the Gray Mountain, and they stay inside. The forest grew thicker around the old ranger station, and the trail to Dead Man's Drop was eventually closed forever. Silas occasionally received letters from old friends in Blackwood who claimed the mountain was appearing closer to the town center. They sent photographs of the horizon that showed the jagged peaks towering over the rooftops in a very threatening way. Silas looked at his old maps, and he realized that the town of Blackwood was no longer where it started. The entire valley had shifted several miles to the north, according to the latest satellite imagery and the local surveys. He remembered the charcoal drawings in the cave, and he realized that Elias had been trying to warn the town. The breathing that the cartographer mentioned was not a metaphor, but a literal description of the earth beneath their feet. Silas finally burned the final recording and the notebook page because the sound of the tapping was becoming too loud. He spent his remaining years in a quiet house far from the mountains where the ground was flat, and the mystery of the vanishing hiker remains one of the greatest unexplained events in the history of the small town. People still whisper about the man who tried to map the heart of the mountain and found something else. The stone cabin is still out there waiting for the next traveler to stumble upon its cold and windowless walls. In this new story, true scary stories from quiet February nights. The rural outskirts of Blacksburg, Virginia, experienced an unusually silent stretch of weather during the first week of February 2020. Mark Henderson was a 45-year-old freelance archivist who lived alone in a renovated farmhouse located several miles from the nearest paved road. He moved to the region specifically for the isolation, which allowed him to process large volumes of historical documents without the distractions of city life. Local dispatch logs indicated that the area was under a stagnant high-pressure system, which resulted in nights that were remarkably still and devoid of wind. Mark spent his evenings working in a second-floor office that offered a panoramic view of the dormant fields and the dense tree line beyond the property fence. On the night of February 4th, Mark reportedly noticed a series of disturbances that did not align with the typical behavior of local woodland animals. He was reviewing a county file from 1984 when he heard a sharp metallic tapping sound originating from the exterior of the ground floor windows. State records from that month showed that temperatures remained well below freezing, which often caused the old timber frames of the house to contract and groan. However, the tapping followed a deliberate and repeating sequence that suggested a source with intent rather than a natural environmental shift. Mark remained in his office while the sound moved slowly from the kitchen windows toward the heavy oak door of the main entrance is less than #. 0 hash is greater than. Investigators later reviewed archive notes from a similar incident that occurred in a neighboring township during the winter of 2012. In that case, a resident claimed that an unidentified individual would stand in the shadows of the porch and tap on the glass with a small stone. County files from 2020 confirm that Mark contacted the local authorities at approximately 11 in the evening to report a potential trespasser on his land. The dispatch logs recorded that he was advised to stay inside and lock all access points until a patrol car could reach his remote location. Mark watched the security monitor in his office, but the infrared cameras showed no heat signatures or movement in the immediate vicinity of the porch. The patrol arrived 30 minutes later and conducted a thorough sweep of the perimeter using high-intensity spotlights to pierce the winter fog. State records indicate that the officers found a series of depressions in the frost that resembled human footprints, but they lacked any discernible tread pattern. Some locals claimed that certain individuals in the region practiced a form of stealth hunting where they wore heavy wool wrappings over their boots to muffle their movement. Investigators never confirmed this theory because the tracks abruptly ended at the edge of the gravel driveway without leading toward the road or the woods. The officers eventually cleared the scene after finding no signs of forced entry or physical damage to the property structure. By the following evening, the silence of the February night returned with an intensity that Mark described as being physically oppressive in his personal journals. He decided to install additional motion-activated lighting around the barn and the rear garden to deter any further unwanted visitors. Reported sightings of a pale figure standing near the tree line had been documented in archived notes from the previous decade, but were never substantiated with photographic evidence. As Mark was adjusting the settings on his laptop, he heard a faint vocalization that sounded like a person whispering his name from the hallway. He checked every room in the farmhouse, but found that he was entirely alone and all the windows remained securely latched from the inside. Records conflict regarding the frequency of these auditory anomalies, as some experts believe the layout of the valley can carry voices over several miles under specific atmospheric conditions. County file from 2009 mentioned that the mineral composition of the local bedrock could cause strange acoustic reflections during periods of extreme cold. Mark reportedly experienced a second night of tapping on the glass, but this time, the sounds originated from the second-floor windows, which were 20 feet above the ground. He retreated to the basement, where he spent the remainder of the night while monitoring the house through his internal security network. Dispatch logs from February 6th show that no further calls were placed by the resident, despite his documented history of reporting disturbances. When a delivery driver arrived at the farmhouse 3 days later, they found the front door standing wide open and the interior lights fully illuminated. State records noted that Mark's vehicle was still parked in the driveway and all of his personal belongings, including his wallet and phone, were found on the kitchen table. Investigators found archived notes in his office that detailed a timeline of the tapping sounds and the specific intervals at which they occurred. A search of the property and the surrounding woods was conducted over a 2-week period, but no trace of Mark Henderson was ever located by the teams. Some locals claimed that he had simply reached a breaking point with the isolation and chose to walk away from his life without a word. The official report remains open, and the house was eventually sold to a family from out of state who reported no unusual activity during their first year of residence. County files from 2022 indicate that the case was transferred to a cold case unit after all forensic leads were exhausted at the site. Investigators never confirmed if the tapping sounds were a prank, a natural phenomenon, or something more targeted toward the previous occupant. The events of that quiet February night serve as a reminder of how easily the silence of the rural landscape can be misunderstood. Mark Henderson remains on the list of missing persons, and the archived notes of his experience are the only evidence that anything unusual ever occurred. During the search of the basement level, investigators discovered a secondary county file from 1976 that had been moved from the upstairs office. This document described a series of disappearances in the Blacksburg area that occurred during the coldest weeks of February over several decades. State records indicated that none of these individuals were ever recovered, and their properties were often found with the doors left unlocked. The archive notes suggested that the incidents were linked by the presence of rhythmic tapping sounds reported by neighbors prior to the disappearances. Forensic teams examined the basement floor and found that the dust layers had been disturbed in a pattern that matched the movement of heavy furniture. No fingerprints other than those belonging to Mark were recovered from the metal filing cabinets or the basement windows. A local historian later provided dispatch logs from 1991 that detailed a similar event involving a retired teacher living in a nearby cabin. This individual had reportedly contacted the authorities to complain about a tall figure that appeared to be mimicking his daily routines from the tree line. Archive notes from the police department showed that the investigation was closed when the teacher moved to a different state without providing a forwarding address. Some locals claimed that the figure was a remnant of a settlement that had been abandoned during the 19th century due to a severe winter. Investigators never confirmed the existence of such a settlement, and the land records from that era remain largely incomplete. The connection between these historical events and the disappearance of Mark Henderson remains purely circumstantial according to state records. The forensic examination of the farmhouse windows revealed that the tapping had left microscopic fractures in the glass that were only visible under specialized lighting. The county file from 2021 noted that these fractures were consistent with a high-frequency vibration rather than a physical strike from a solid object. This data conflicted with Mark's original report of someone using a small stone to tap on the exterior of the house. Investigators searched the local power grid logs to see if a malfunctioning electrical transformer could have caused the vibrations, but the results were negative. State records indicate that the surrounding properties did not experience any similar glass damage or auditory disturbances during the month of February. The source of the energy required to create such precise fractures in the tempered glass remains unidentified by technical experts. The search for Mark Henderson was officially suspended in late March when the spring thaw began to saturate the low-lying areas of the property. Dispatch logs from the final day of the operation noted that the canine units were consistently drawn to a specific section of the limestone cliffs. Archive notes from the Geological Survey team mentioned that these cliffs contained several deep fissures that were not large enough for a person to enter. However, the dogs continued to alert on the openings until the handlers were forced to move them away due to the hazardous terrain. State records from that period show no evidence of human remains or clothing being found near the rock formations. The mystery of the quiet February nights in Blacksburg continues to be a subject of local speculation among those who remember the archivist. In the years following the disappearance, several hikers reported hearing rhythmic tapping while camping in the woods near the old Henderson farmhouse. The county file from 2024 recorded a statement from a group of students who claimed the sound followed them for several miles. Investigators never confirmed these reports as the students were unable to provide a recording of the sounds or a specific location for the source. State records show that the forest in that region is now designated as a protected zone with limited access during the winter months. The archive notes from the Henderson case are still referenced by researchers interested in the acoustic anomalies of the Appalachian foothills. No further evidence has emerged to explain the events of February 2020, and the file remains in the state archives. The final entry in Mark's personal journal mentioned a feeling of intense cold that seemed to permeate the house despite the functioning heating system. He wrote that the silence outside was so absolute that he could hear the sound of his own heartbeat echoing through the walls. County files suggest that this psychological state is common among individuals experiencing long periods of extreme isolation in remote environments. However, the physical evidence of the footprints and the glass fractures continues to challenge the theory of a purely psychological event. Investigators never confirmed if Mark was aware of the 1976 file before he began experiencing the disturbances at the farmhouse. The story of the quiet February nights remains a cold case in the records of the Virginia State Police. In this news story, home alone during a snowstorm, then someone knocked. The winter of 2018 brought a historic blizzard to the Catskill Mountains that stranded many residents for several days. 24-year-old Emily Vance was a freelance graphic designer who had rented a remote cabin to finish her work. She reportedly planned to stay for 14 days, but a heavy snowstorm began to bury the house on the third night. According to dispatch logs from the Sullivan County Sheriff, she made a call regarding an unidentified visitor late that same evening. County files from 2018 indicate that the cabin was located miles away from the nearest neighbor in a dense forest. Emily had stocked up on supplies because she didn't want to leave the property until her big project was finally finished. The electricity reportedly failed around 10 o'clock at night as the wind speeds reached 50 miles per hour outside the cabin. She used a small kerosene lamp to light the living room while she listened to the sounds of the heavy wooden structure. A state record mentions that the temperature inside the home dropped to 40 degrees within just a few hours of the outage. Emily was huddled under several blankets when she first heard a soft, rhythmic tapping against the heavy oak front door that night. She initially dismissed the sound as a tree branch because the storm was shaking the entire foundation of the small mountain cabin. However, the knocking became much louder and more deliberate, as if someone was trying to get her attention through the thick wood. Dispatch logs from that evening show that Emily called the local authorities at exactly 11:22 to report a suspicious person. The operator reportedly told her that no patrol cars could reach her location until the snowplows cleared the main access road. Emily grabbed a heavy kitchen knife and moved toward the window to see if anyone was standing on the covered front porch. The glass was completely covered in thick frost, which prevented her from seeing anything beyond the blurry reflection of her own face. The sound of the knocking suddenly moved from the front door to the back of the house near the small kitchen area. Emily reportedly felt a sense of dread because the back door was much thinner and the lock wasn't as secure as before. She stayed in the middle of the room because she didn't want to be near any of the large glass windows or doors. The operator could hear the sound of something heavy hitting the side of the house while Emily was still on the phone. State records describe this sound as a blunt impact that was strong enough to shake the kitchen cabinets and rattle the plates. Archived notes from the following investigation state that the knocking continued for nearly 20 minutes without any verbal response from outside. Emily shouted through the door, but she didn't hear any voice over the sound of the wind screaming through the frozen trees. Some locals claimed that a drifter had been seen walking along the highway several miles south of the cabin earlier that day. Investigators never confirmed the identity of this individual or if they had the equipment to survive in such a brutal winter storm. The state records indicate that the footprints found later were far too large to belong to any of the local forest residents. Records conflict regarding whether the front door had been tampered with or if the locks were simply frozen shut from the ice. Morning light revealed a strange scene that the investigators would later document in a detailed county file from 2019 for court. There were no human footprints in the deep snow surrounding the cabin, despite the clear reports of someone circling the entire perimeter. Instead, the search team found deep, circular indentations in the ice that didn't match any known footwear or local wildlife in New York. Some locals claimed that the pressure of the frozen ground can sometimes create unusual patterns during a very rapid change in temperature. Investigators never confirmed this theory because the marks were concentrated specifically around the entry points of the remote mountain home during the storm. Archived notes from the lead detective suggest that someone might have used stilts or another device to avoid leaving recognizable human tracks. The investigation turned to the history of the property, which had been built on an old logging site from the 1950s. County files indicate that the land had been the subject of many legal disputes regarding the boundaries of the neighboring state park. A state record from 2012 mentions a similar incident where a previous tenant reported hearing rhythmic knocking during a heavy rainstorm. Some locals claimed that the cabin was built over a natural vent that produced strange acoustic effects when the wind was strong. Investigators never confirmed if the sound of the knocking was a physical person or just a very rare environmental phenomenon of nature. Records conflict about whether the previous tenant had actually seen a figure standing in the woods before they decided to move out. Emily decided to leave the cabin immediately after the roads were cleared because she didn't feel safe staying there any longer alone. She reportedly told the investigators that she felt like someone was watching her from the tree line as she packed her car. Dispatch logs from the following week show that she called once more to report a strange vehicle parked at the gate entrance. When the deputies arrived, they found a set of archived notes sitting on the passenger seat of an abandoned and rusted truck. These notes belonged to a former surveyor who had disappeared in the same region during a similar winter storm in 2011. State records describe the surveyor as a very experienced man who knew the mountain trails better than almost anyone else in the county. The discovery of the abandoned truck led the investigators to believe that the two cases might be connected by a single individual. However, there were no signs of life inside the vehicle, and the engine had been cold for at least several months already. Some locals claimed that they had seen the old truck moving through the woods at night without any of its headlights turned on. Investigators never confirmed these sightings because the mechanical condition of the vehicle made it impossible for it to be driven by anyone. County files from 2019 show that the truck was registered to a man who had passed away over 10 years earlier. This data conflict caused a lot of confusion for the detectives who were trying to find a logical explanation for recent events. Emily moved back to the city, but she reportedly continued to have nightmares about the rhythmic knocking on the heavy oak door. She couldn't forget the way the house shook or the feeling that something was trying to find a way inside the warm cabin. Dispatch logs reveal that several other residents in the Catskill Mountains reported similar sounds during the remainder of the winter of 2018. Every report mentioned the same pattern of knocking, followed by a period of silence and then a heavy blow against the walls. State records never identified a suspect or a group of people who might have been responsible for these strange and terrifying events. The case remains an open file in the county office because the physical evidence doesn't support a clear conclusion for the record. The archived notes from the surveyor's truck contained several maps of the region with specific locations marked with a small red circle. One of these circles was located exactly at the coordinates of the cabin where Emily had been staying during the winter blizzard. State records indicate that the surveyor was investigating reports of strange ground vibrations that were occurring deep within the mountain forest area. He reportedly believed that these vibrations were caused by a hidden geological feature that had never been properly documented by the government. Some locals claimed that the sounds were much more frequent during the winter months when the ground was frozen and the air thin. Investigators never confirmed the existence of any such feature because the terrain was too dangerous to explore with the heavy drilling equipment. County files from 2020 include a summary of the forensic evidence found on the exterior of the mountain cabin after the snow. The siding of the house showed signs of being struck by a flat object with a surface area of approximately 4 inches. These marks were located nearly 7 feet above the ground, which is much higher than a person could reach without a ladder. Dispatch logs from the search team mention that no ladders or large tools were found anywhere on the property during the sweep. Investigators never confirmed if the marks were made by a tool or by a biological entity that possessed a very high reach. The state records focus on the possibility of falling ice chunks from the roof, but the pattern of the marks was consistent. Emily's lawyer reportedly requested a copy of the archive notes to see if there was any mention of a specific person nearby. The county files mention a recluse who lived in a cave system several miles away, but he had a very solid alibi. Records conflict regarding the exact location of this individual during the night of the blizzard when the knocking first began at door. Some locals claimed that the recluse was a peaceful man who didn't have any reason to harass a stranger in the winter. Investigators never confirmed his involvement, and he eventually stopped cooperating with the local sheriff's department after the first few rounds of questioning. The lack of a clear suspect made it impossible for the state to file any formal charges in the case of Emily. A final review of the dispatch logs from 2018 revealed a third call that had been dropped due to poor signal. In this short recording, Emily sounded much more panicked, and she mentioned seeing a shadow moving across the frosted glass of window. She reportedly said that the shadow was too thin to be a person, and it seemed to glide rather than walk on. Investigators never confirmed the presence of such a figure, and they attributed the sighting to the high stress of the dangerous situation. State records indicate that the cabin was sold later that year to a developer who planned to tear it down and build. The new owner reportedly found a collection of small stones arranged in a circle on the porch after the first light snow. These stones were perfectly smooth, and they didn't match any of the rocks found in the immediate vicinity of the property. County files from 2021 state that the new owner decided to abandon the project and sell the land back. He didn't provide a specific reason for his decision, but he mentioned that the atmosphere of the forest felt very unwelcoming. Some locals claimed that the mountain has a memory of the things that have happened there over the many long years. Investigators never confirmed these claims because they don't deal with the legends or the local folklore of the rural mountain regions. The archived notes from the original case are now kept in a secure storage facility in the city of Albany for reference. Emily now lives in a high-rise apartment building in a different state, where she feels much safer behind layers of security. She still checks the locks on her doors every single night before she goes to bed because she can't forget sound. Dispatch logs from her new neighborhood show that she has never called the police since she moved away from the Catskills. However, she reportedly keeps a small lamp burning in the hallway to remind her that she is no longer alone in dark. State records from New York show that the cabin was eventually reclaimed by the forest as the roof collapsed under snow. No one has lived on that specific piece of land since the events of 2018 when the knocking began during storm. The state records from 2022 describe a discovery made by a team of scientists who were studying the soil. They found a series of metallic fragments buried near the foundation of the old cabin that were composed of a rare, archived notes from the laboratory state that the fragments showed signs of extreme heat exposure despite being buried in the ground. Investigators never confirmed where the metal came from or if it had any connection to the sounds Emily heard during blizzard. Records conflict about whether the fragments were part of an old industrial machine or if they belonged to something much more. Some locals claimed that the area had been used for clandestine military testing during the 1970s, but this was never verified. County files indicate that the metallic fragments were located exactly beneath the spot where the heavy knocking had been reported by tenant. The soil in that specific area was reportedly devoid of any life, including the typical insects and fungi found in forest. Dispatch logs from the environmental team record a sense of unease as they worked near the ruins of the collapsed cabin. One of the scientists reportedly mentioned that his electronic sensors were malfunctioning whenever he approached the center of the old building. This data conflict led to a temporary halt in the research project until the equipment could be properly shielded from interference. Investigators never confirmed the source of the magnetic field that was causing the sensors to display such erratic and unpredictable data. The archived notes from the surveyor who disappeared in 2011 were re-examined by a specialist in the state police. These notes contained a drawing of a strange structure that he had found hidden deep within a narrow crevice in rocks. The drawing depicted a series of metallic poles that were arranged in a pattern that looked remarkably similar to the indentations. Some locals claimed that they had seen similar poles while hiking in the more remote sections of the mountain forest years. Investigators never confirmed the existence of the structure because the surveyor had not provided the exact coordinates in his personal. State records from 2023 show that the case remains officially unsolved despite the new evidence found by research team. The mystery of the knocking during the snowstorm of 2018 continues to haunt the people who live in Catskills. Dispatch logs are still analyzed by amateur investigators who believe they can find the one detail that the police managed to overlook. Every winter, when the snow begins to fall and the wind starts to howl, residents are reminded of the story. They reportedly make sure to check their locks and stay away from the windows when they hear a tapping sound. County files from 2024 list the area as a restricted zone due to the potential dangers of terrain. Investigators never confirmed if the danger was purely physical or if there was something else that the state wanted hidden. In this new story, 3 disturbing small-town horror stories. Part 1. The town where nobody locked their doors. Most people in the American heartland believe that absolute trust is a sign of a healthy and safe community. This account from a remote mountain village suggests that leaving your front door unlatched might be an invitation for disaster. In the isolated village of Blackwood Hollow, the local culture was built on the fact that no one locked doors. Harlan Reed was a 41-year-old postal carrier who walked the quiet streets of the Hollow every afternoon. He had lived in the town since 1982, and he knew the specific habits of every single neighbor. The locals believed that their safety was guaranteed by the surrounding mountains and the long history of their shared ancestors. Harlan enjoyed the predictability of his route because it allowed him to finish his work before the early winter darkness. He often dropped off packages directly inside the mudrooms of the elderly residents who could not easily reach their porches. This level of trust was the foundation of the town, and no one ever questioned the safety of the practice. The atmosphere began to change during the first week of November in the year 2021 without any warning. Harlan was delivering a heavy box to a Victorian-style home owned by a woman named Mrs. Gable, who lived. He pushed the front door open as he had done for 15 years, but he felt a sudden and sharp. The house was silent, and the air inside felt significantly colder than the crisp autumn breeze blowing through the yard. He called out for Mrs. Gable, but his voice seemed to be absorbed by the heavy curtains and thick rugs. He noticed that the furniture in the living room had been moved into a tight circle facing the front door. This was strange because the elderly woman was known for her obsession with keeping her home in a perfect state. Harlan left the package on the floor and stepped back outside because he could not shake the feeling of... He mentioned the odd encounter to the local sheriff named Silas Thorne while they were eating lunch at the diner. Silas suggested that the woman was simply redecorating for the upcoming holiday season in the Hollow, but Harlan remained. By the middle of the following week, Harlan noticed similar patterns in several other homes along his daily delivery route. Doors were standing wide open even when the temperature dropped below freezing, and the residents were nowhere to be seen. He stopped at the home of a young mechanic named Elias Vance, who was usually working in his garage. The garage was empty and the tools were scattered across the concrete floor as if they had been dropped suddenly. Harlan walked to the back door and found it unlatched and swinging slowly in the damp and heavy wind. He entered the kitchen and saw 3 plates of steaming hot food sitting on the small wooden table in silence. The family was gone, but the television was still playing a local news broadcast from a city 50 miles away. He felt a sense of vertigo as he realized the residents had not simply walked away from their homes. Harlan decided to conduct his own investigation because the authorities seemed disinterested in the strange behavior of the quiet town. He returned to the post office and began to look through the historical archives of Blackwood Hollow from many decades. He found a series of newspaper clippings that described a similar event that occurred in the winter of 1950. Several families had disappeared from their homes overnight, leaving behind open doors and half-eaten meals on their dining tables. The reports mentioned that the only witness was a young boy who spoke about it.